The wedding ring trembled in her palm as Marion Hale faced the sneering shopkeeper, her pregnant belly pressed against the counter's edge. 6 months a widow, 3 days without food, and this golden band was all that stood between survival and starvation in the merciless Arizona territory of 1878. But before desperation could force her hand, a weathered cowboy's voice cut through the stale air. $50, and she keeps the ring. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The heat in Tucson bore down like God's own anvil that September afternoon, turning the main street into a shimmering ribbon of dust and broken dreams. Inside Fletcher's general store, the air hung thick with the smell of salt pork, tobacco, and the particular stench of human cruelty that only desperation could produce. Marion Hale stood at the wooden counter, her threadbare calico dress doing little to hide her condition. 6 months pregnant, her face gaunt from hunger, she clutched the gold wedding ring in fingers that had grown thin as kindling. The metal was warm from being held so tightly during the 2-mile walk from her unfinished homestead, and even warmer from the tears she'd cried over it the night before. "I said $2, Mrs. Hale." Cyrus Fletcher leaned back in his chair, his thumbs hooked in his vest, eyes glittering with the cold arithmetic of a man who'd seen too many desperate people walk through his door. "Take it or leave it. Gold's common as dirt these days, what with the mines running full tilt." This was a lie, and they both knew it. The ring would fetch $10 easily, maybe $15 in Tucson. But Cyrus Fletcher had learned long ago that hungry people don't bargain well. Marion's throat worked, but no words came. She looked down at the ring, simple, unadorned, but engraved inside with words that had once meant everything. "All my days, Daniel." Her husband had worked 3 months of overtime at the Silver Queen mine to afford it, presenting it to her on their wedding day with hands still black with rock dust and eyes bright with promises of the life they'd build together. That was 14 months ago. Daniel Hale had been dead for 3. "Mrs. Hale?" Fletcher's voice carried that false patience that men use when they're enjoying someone else's suffering. "I've got customers waiting." There were no other customers. The store was empty save for the 3 of them, Fletcher behind his counter, Marion before it, and old Morton Griggs pretending to examine axe handles in the corner while actually watching the whole sorry scene unfold with the avid attention of a man whose own life held too little entertainment. Marion drew a shaking breath. The baby kicked inside her, a small flutter that felt like accusation. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. The last of Daniel's savings had gone to pay the land office fees, the doctor who'd tried and failed to save her husband after the cave-in, and the preacher who'd said words over a pine box that held what little they'd recovered of the man she'd loved. The garden she'd tried to plant had withered in the brutal sun. The chickens had been taken by coyotes. The cow had dried up and died. Even her wedding dress had been traded months ago for flour and beans that were long gone now. All she had left was this ring and the child growing inside her. "I'll need enough for flour, beans, salt pork, and coffee," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying across the counter. "Enough to last 2 weeks, maybe 3, if I'm careful." Fletcher snorted. $2 won't buy you half that, woman. You'll get a sack of cornmeal and some bacon fat. That's it." "Please." The word came out broken. "I'm carrying a child. I just need—" "Should have thought of that before your husband went and got himself killed." Fletcher's words hit like a slap. "I'm running a business here, not a charity house for widows who can't manage their affairs." Marion's face went white. Morton Griggs shifted uncomfortably in the corner but said nothing. Speaking up would mean making an enemy of Fletcher, and a man needed to shop somewhere. The door opened, bringing with it a blast of furnace-hot air and the jingle of spurs. None of them paid much attention at first. Cowboys drifted through Tucson regularly, heading to or from the ranches that sprawled across the territory like brown stains on an already brown land. This one was tall, lean in the way of men who'd spent more time in the saddle than out of it, his face weathered to the color of saddle leather beneath the brim of a dusty black hat. He moved with the careful economy of motion that came from years of hard living, his spurs making almost no sound despite their silver decoration. His clothes were trail-worn but well-maintained, leather vest over a faded blue shirt, pants tucked into boots that had seen better days but were clean and oiled. A gun rode his hip in a holster that showed the smooth wear of long use. Elias Boone had been riding for 3 weeks, heading south to Sonora, where a friend had promised work breaking horses for the Mexican army. He'd stopped in Tucson to resupply before the last push through the desert, expecting nothing more than a quick transaction and a cold beer before moving on. What he hadn't expected was to walk into the middle of a woman's quiet devastation. He caught the tail end of Fletcher's words, something about widows and charity, and saw the woman at the counter flinch as if she'd been struck, saw the way her hand closed around something small and golden, saw the swell of her belly beneath the worn dress and the desperate set of her shoulders. Elias Boone had seen a lot of hard things in his 34 years. He'd fought in the war as a boy, buried his parents to fever, lost his sister and her children to Comanche raiders, and spent the years since drifting from job to job, town to town, carrying his grief like a saddle that never quite fit right. He'd learned to keep his head down, to not get involved, to take care of his horse and his gun and himself, and let the rest of the world sort itself out. But there was something about the way this woman stood, straight-backed despite the hunger in her face, clutching that ring like it was the last piece of solid ground in a world that had turned to quicksand, that reached past all his carefully constructed defenses and touched something he'd thought had died along with everyone he'd ever loved. $2, Fletcher was saying again, louder now, as if volume would somehow make the insult fair. Final offer. You can take it, or you can walk back out into that heat with nothing but your pride to fill your belly. Marian's fingers trembled as she began to lower the ring to the counter. Excuse me. Elias's voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a man who'd learned to make himself heard in saloons, on battlefields, and across miles of open range. I couldn't help overhearing your transaction. Fletcher's eyes narrowed. This is a private matter between me and Mrs. Hale. Didn't sound very private, seeing as how I heard it from outside. Elias stepped up to the counter, positioning himself slightly between Marian and the shopkeeper in a move so subtle it seemed almost accidental. Almost. That ring she's holding, you said $2? That's right. Not that it's any of your concern, Cowboy. Elias picked up his hat, which he'd removed upon entering, and set it deliberately on the counter. Then he reached into his vest and produced a leather purse, worn soft from years of use. The coins inside clinked with a sound that made Fletcher lean forward unconsciously. I'll give you $50 for it, Elias said quietly. The store went absolutely silent. Marian's head jerked up, her eyes wide with shock. Fletcher's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Even Morton Griggs stopped pretending to examine axe handles. 50? Fletcher sputtered. Now see here, that ring isn't worth but $50, Elias repeated, his tone unchanged. And she keeps the ring. He set the entire purse on the counter between them, with a soft thump that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. That's every dollar I've earned in 3 months of work, Elias continued, his eyes locked on Fletcher's face. Should be more than enough to cover her supplies. Whatever's left, you can keep for your trouble. But the ring stays with Mrs. Hale. Marian made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. Sir, I can't possibly. Yes, you can. Elias turned to her, and his voice gentled in a way that made something crack open in her chest. And you will. That ring's not for sale, ma'am, but your supplies are bought and paid for. I don't understand. Tears were streaming down her face now, silent and unstoppable. You don't even know me. Don't need to. He pushed the purse toward Fletcher, who was staring at it like a snake he couldn't decide whether to strike or flee from. Some things are right, and some things are wrong. Man doesn't need an introduction to tell the difference. Fletcher's hand hovered over the purse. $50 was more than he'd make in a month, even cheating widows and desperate prospectors. But accepting it meant acknowledging that he'd been ready to rob this woman blind for a fraction of what her ring was worth, and doing so in front of witnesses. I suppose, he said slowly, trying to recover some dignity, that I could make an exception in this case, since the gentleman is so generous. That's what I thought. Elias's voice could have cut glass. Now, Mrs. Hale needs flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, and anything else you'd recommend for a woman in her condition. Good quality, mind you. None of that weevily meal you keep in the back for Indians and drifters. Fletcher's face went red, but he began pulling items from the shelves with jerky, angry movements. Marion stood frozen, the ring still clutched in her hand, tears dripping off her chin onto the worn floorboards. She looked at this stranger, this weathered cowboy, who'd appeared out of nowhere like something from a fever dream, and couldn't make sense of what had just happened. "Why?" she whispered. Elias turned back to her, and for just a moment she saw past the hard exterior to the grief he carried like a second shadow. "Had a sister once," he said quietly. "Sarah. She died when her husband couldn't get help fast enough after her second baby came early. I wasn't there. Couldn't help. I was—" He stopped, shook his head. "Doesn't matter where I was. Point is, I see a woman who needs help. I'm damn well going to help if I can. I'll pay you back." The words came out fierce despite her tears. "Every penny, I swear it." "No need." He picked up a sack of flour that Fletcher had slammed onto the counter and tested its weight with the automatic expertise of someone who'd bought a lot of supplies in a lot of stores. "This is good. What else?" By the time Fletcher had finished, sullenly, resentfully, but with goods that were actually fresh and properly measured, the pile on the counter had grown to more than Marion had seen in months. There was 20 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of beans, a thick slab of salt pork wrapped in brown paper, coffee, sugar, dried apples, a tin of lard, even a small bag of peppermint sticks that Elias added with a slight smile when Fletcher wasn't looking. "That should hold you a while," Elias said, starting to load items into a crate he'd found by the door. "I live 2 miles out," Marion managed, trying to compose herself. "On the old Hutchins claim. I have a wagon, but I'll drive you." It wasn't a question or an offer, just a simple statement of fact, as if there had never been any other possible outcome to this encounter. "Sir, I couldn't possibly—" "Ma'am?" He turned to face her fully, and his eyes were kind despite their weathered sadness. "You're going to need help loading this. You're going to need help unloading it. And unless I miss my guess, you're going to need help getting that wagon back down a road that's probably half washed out from the summer storms. Now, you can argue with me about it here, or you can let me do what I'm going to do anyway and save us both the time and trouble." She opened her mouth, closed it, then did something that surprised them both. She laughed, a short, slightly hysterical sound that she quickly stifled with her hand. "I'm sorry," she said. "It's just, this morning I woke up thinking I'd have to sell my wedding ring for a few days' worth of meal, and now I'm standing here with more food than I've seen in months, and a strange cowboy is insisting on driving me home, and I don't even know your name." "Elias Boone, ma'am." He touched his hat brim. "Late of Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and most recently the Broken J Ranch up near Prescott. Marion Hale." She clutched the ring to her chest. "Late of Ohio, and currently of nowhere in particular. Ohio's a long way from Arizona territory. So's Texas." "That it is, Mrs. Hale. That it is." They loaded the supplies into her wagon, a battered buckboard with one wheel that squeaked ominously, while Fletcher watched from his doorway with poorly disguised anger. Morton Griggs had disappeared at some point, no doubt rushing to spread word of the strange cowboy who'd spent $50 on a pregnant widow he'd never met. By the time they'd finished, the sun had started its long slide toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and rust. Marion climbed up onto the wagon seat with difficulty, her pregnancy making the movement awkward, and Elias swung up beside her without comment. "The Hutchins place is south," she said quietly. "Follow the main road for about a mile, then take the fork that heads toward Copper Creek." Elias clicked his tongue, and the 2 horses, his own tied to the back of the wagon, started forward at a steady walk. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the wagon, the jingle of harness, and the endless whisper of wind across the desert. Marion kept glancing at the man beside her, trying to make sense of him. His face was hard, carved by sun and wind into planes and angles that spoke of years of outdoor living, but his hands on the reins were gentle, and when she'd stumbled while climbing up, he'd steadied her with a touch so careful it was as if she were made of glass. "Can I ask you something?" she finally ventured. "Yes, ma'am." "Why were you carrying so much money?" If you don't mind me asking. Elias was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the road ahead. Was heading south. Friend of mine's got a horse-breaking contract with the Mexican army. Good pay, steady work. That was my stake. Money to get me there and set up until the first payday. Marion's stomach dropped. Then you just gave away everything you have. Still got my horse, still got my gun, still got my hands and my back. He shrugged. Man can always make more money, can always make things right when he has the chance. But your job in Mexico. There'll be other jobs, Mrs. Hale. Always are. She fell silent again, overwhelmed. The sun was lower now, and the heat was finally beginning to break, though the rocks still radiated warmth like the sides of an oven. In the distance, she could see the dark line of trees that marked Copper Creek, and beyond it, the rough shape of her unfinished cabin. That's it, she said, pointing. The cabin with the half-built walls. Elias studied it as they drew closer, his expression unreadable. Daniel had started building the place in the spring, working every evening and weekend to raise the walls and frame the roof. He'd gotten the main structure up, had even finished one room completely, but the roof was only half shingled, the windows were just empty holes covered with oiled paper, and the barn was nothing but corner posts and a prayer. Then the mine had collapsed, and Daniel had been buried under 1,000 tons of rock, and Marion had been left with a half-built dream and no idea how to finish it. Your husband do all this himself? Elias asked as they pulled into the yard. Daniel was a carpenter before he came west, good with his hands. Her voice caught. He wanted to finish it before the baby came, wanted us to be settled. Elias climbed down and began unloading the supplies without comment. Marion tried to help, but he waved her toward the cabin door. You point me to where things go. I'll bring them in. The interior of the cabin was painfully neat, a woman's desperate attempt to maintain order in a life that had spiraled into chaos. The single finished room served as everything: bedroom, kitchen, and living space. A narrow bed stood in one corner, made up with a faded quilt. A small table and 2 chairs occupied the center. A cook stove, rusty but functional, sat against one wall, its pipe disappearing through the half-finished roof. Everything was spotlessly clean but heartbreakingly sparse. A few dishes, a single pot, 2 cups, 1 fork, 1 spoon, 1 knife, the possessions of people who'd had to sell everything that wasn't absolutely necessary to survive. Elias made multiple trips, carrying sacks of flour and beans, the salt pork, the coffee and sugar, arranging them all neatly on the rough shelves Daniel had built. He worked with an efficiency that spoke of long practice at making and breaking camp, at living out of saddlebags and wagon beds, at knowing exactly what was needed and where it should go. When he was finished, he stood in the doorway, looking around with an expression that might have been sadness or might have been anger. Mrs. Hale, this roof won't hold when the rains come. I know. She stood by the cook stove, her arms wrapped around herself despite the heat. Daniel meant to finish it before... She stopped. I've been trying, but I don't know how. The ladder's broken, and I can't... She gestured at her belly, helpless. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then, You got any more lumber? Some, behind the barn. But I can't pay... Didn't ask if you could pay. Asked if you had lumber. Marion's throat worked. Mr. Boone, you've already... Ma'am, I'm going to lay this out plain because the sun's going down and I need to decide whether I'm camping here tonight or riding back to town. He took off his hat, ran a hand through sweat-dampened hair. That roof is dangerous. If we get a storm, and we will get storms, this is monsoon season, that whole thing could come down on your head. The walls need bracing. Those window holes need proper shutters. And that excuse for a barn needs to be finished before winter, or any animals you manage to get will freeze. I know all that, she said quietly. I just don't know what to do about it. I do. He met her eyes. I spent 5 years building homesteads in Oklahoma after the war. I'm handy with a hammer and saw. You let me stay in that barn, or what there is of it, for a few days, and I'll get this place weather-tight before I move on. A few days. She repeated the words carefully, as if testing them for traps. Week at most, just until the urgent work is done. Why would you do this? Already told you. Some things are right, and some things are wrong. Marion stood there in her half-finished cabin, looking at this stranger who'd already given her more than anyone had since Daniel died. Part of her wanted to say no, to maintain some shred of dignity and independence, but a larger part, the part that was terrified and exhausted and carrying a child she couldn't figure out how to keep alive, knew that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "All right," she said finally. "But I cook your meals. That's payment." A smile ghosted across his weathered face. "Yes, ma'am. That sounds more than fair." He went back out to tend to his horse, a rangy bay gelding with intelligent eyes and white socks on its hind legs, while Marian stood in her cabin, clutching Daniel's ring in one hand and pressing the other to her belly where their child was moving. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered. "Is he an angel or just a drifter with a kind heart?" The baby kicked, which she chose to interpret as approval. Outside, Elias Boone unsaddled his horse and rubbed it down, his movements automatic after so many years of the same routine. He hadn't been lying about the job in Mexico. It had been a good opportunity, and he'd been looking forward to it. But when he'd walked into that general store and seen Marian Hale standing there, starving and desperate, trying to trade her dead husband's ring for enough food to survive another week, something in him had simply shifted. He thought about Sarah, his sister, dying alone while he was off chasing work in Kansas. Thought about all those people he hadn't been able to help over the years because he'd been too late, too far away, too wrapped up in his own grief to see theirs. Here, finally, was someone he could help, someone who needed it desperately, someone who was right in front of him instead of 3 states away or 6 feet under. He'd figure out what came after when after arrived. For now, there was work to do. The sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, and the desert began its nightly transformation from furnace to icebox. Inside the cabin, Marian lit a lamp and started to cook the first real meal she'd had in days. Salt pork fried with beans, cornbread made from fresh flour, coffee so strong and good it almost made her cry. When she called Elias in to eat, he washed his hands in the bucket by the door and sat down at the small table, as if he'd done so 1,000 times before. They ate in comfortable silence, too hungry for conversation. And when they were finished, Marian brought out the peppermint sticks he'd bought. "These are for the baby," Elias said. "Baby won't be here for 3 more months." She broke one in half and handed him a piece. "We can share." The peppermint was sweet and sharp on her tongue, a taste she hadn't experienced in so long it felt almost like a memory. Elias sucked on his piece thoughtfully, then pulled out a small leather notebook from his vest pocket. "What's that?" Marian asked. "List of what needs doing. Roof first. That's urgent. Then the window shutters. Then we need to think about securing your water source before winter. That creek'll freeze solid come December, and you'll need a cistern or you'll be melting snow just to cook." Marian listened as he talked through the repairs with the easy confidence of a man who'd built a dozen homesteads and knew every potential problem before it arose. His voice was low and steady, punctuated by the scratch of pencil on paper as he sketched out plans and made notes. She found herself relaxing for the first time in months, the constant knot of anxiety in her chest loosening just slightly. Maybe it wouldn't be enough. Maybe she'd still lose everything when winter came. But for tonight, in this moment, she had food in her belly, a roof, however incomplete, over her head, and someone who seemed genuinely interested in making sure she survived. It was more than she'd had yesterday. It was more than she'd dared hope for. "Mr. Boone?" she said when he finally closed the notebook. "Yes, ma'am?" "Thank you. I know I've said it already, but thank you. You saved my life today." He looked at her across the lamplight, his eyes shadowed but kind. "Just doing what any decent man would do, Mrs. Hale." "We both know that's not true." She touched the ring on her finger. She'd slipped it back on as soon as they'd left Fletcher's store. "Most men would have walked right past." "Then most men are fools." He stood, picking up his plate. "I'll wash these and be out of your way. You need your rest." She wanted to protest, but exhaustion was crashing over her in waves now that the adrenaline of the day had worn off. She nodded, standing carefully. "There's a blanket in the barn. It's not much, but—" "I've slept in worse places, ma'am. Don't you worry about me." He washed the dishes in the bucket, dried them carefully, and put them back on the shelf. Then he touched his hat brim to her, a gesture that was somehow both formal and intimate. and stepped out into the night. Marion stood in her cabin, listening to his footsteps fade toward the barn. Through the window, just an empty frame covered with oiled paper, she could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She thought about Daniel, about the life they'd planned and lost, about the baby growing inside her who would never know their father, about all the ways her life had narrowed down to this: a half-built cabin, a pregnancy she didn't know how to survive, and a future that had looked like nothing but hunger and fear. Until today. Until a weathered cowboy had walked into Fletcher's store and said, $50, and she keeps the ring. Marion undressed carefully, hanging her dress on a peg, and climbed into bed. The sheets smelled of sun and soap. She'd washed them just yesterday in creek water, scrubbing them on rocks because she didn't have a proper washboard. As she lay there in the darkness, one hand on her belly and the other clutching the ring that had nearly been sold for $2 worth of cornmeal, she allowed herself something she hadn't permitted in months. She allowed herself to hope. Outside, in the incomplete barn, Elias Boone wrapped himself in a worn blanket and used his saddle as a pillow, the same way he'd slept for years, in 100 different places, always alone. But tonight felt different somehow. Tonight he wasn't just drifting through, killing time until the next job or the next town. Tonight he had a purpose, clear and immediate and right in front of him. Fix the roof. Build the shutters. Make sure Marion Hale and her unborn child survived the winter. It wasn't much, as purposes went. It wouldn't bring back Sarah or his parents or anyone else he'd lost. It wouldn't erase the war or the years of drifting or the particular loneliness that came from having no place and no people to call his own. But it was something, and something, after so many years of nothing, felt like enough. He closed his eyes and slept and dreamed of hammers and nails and the satisfying sound of wood fitting perfectly into place. In the cabin, Marion slept too, deeper and more peacefully than she had in 3 months. Neither of them knew that this was just the beginning, that the choice Elias had made in Fletcher's store would change both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. They didn't know about the storms coming, both literal and metaphorical. Didn't know about the gossip that would spread through Tucson like wildfire, or the challenges winter would bring, or the slow, careful way 2 broken people could rebuild not just a cabin, but themselves. All they knew was this: tonight, they were both a little less alone than they'd been this morning. And in the hard country of the Arizona Territory in 1878, that was enough of a miracle to carry them through to tomorrow. The moon rose, silver and patient, over the half-built cabin and its unlikely inhabitants. In the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. The desert wind whispered through the mesquite and creosote, carrying secrets and promises in equal measure. And in the barn, Elias Boone's lips curved in a slight smile as he slept, because for the first time in longer than he could remember, he'd be waking up with somewhere to be and someone who needed him there. It was a good feeling, a feeling worth writing back from. Morning would come soon enough, bringing with it the work that needed doing. But for now, there was just the peaceful darkness, 2 people sleeping under the same patch of stars, and the quiet, fragile beginning of something that might, if they were careful, if they were lucky, if they were brave, become something worth keeping. Dawn broke pale and cool over the Arizona Territory, the sun still hidden behind the eastern mountains, but painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Elias woke as he always did, instantly, completely, with the ingrained wariness of a man who'd learned that the difference between sleep and waking could mean the difference between living and dying. For a moment he lay still, orienting himself before memory returned. The widow, the cabin, the work that waited. He rolled to his feet, his body protesting only slightly despite the hard ground and thin blanket. 34 wasn't old, but it was old enough to feel every night spent sleeping rough, every injury that hadn't quite healed right, every year of hard living written into muscle and bone. The barn, such as it was, consisted of 4 corner posts, a few crossbeams, and not much else. Daniel Hale had clearly planned something ambitious, but hadn't lived long enough to see it through. Elias ran a hand along one of the posts, testing its stability. Solid work, at least. The man had known what he was doing. He saddled his horse and rode the short distance to the creek to water the animal and refill his canteen. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, fed by springs somewhere up in the mountains. Good water. A man could build a life around water like this, if he had the time and the will and someone to build it with. When he returned to the cabin, smoke was rising from the chimney, thin and gray against the brightening sky. Through the open door, the actual door, not just a frame, he could see Marian moving around inside, her movements slow but purposeful. "Morning, ma'am," he called, not wanting to startle her. She appeared in the doorway, one hand pressed to the small of her back in that universal gesture of pregnant women everywhere. In the morning light, he could see how young she really was. Maybe 22, 23 at most. Far too young to be a widow. Far too young to be facing what she was facing alone. "Good morning, Mr. Boone. I've got coffee on, if you'd like some." "That sounds mighty fine." He tied his horse to the hitching post, one of the few finished elements of the homestead, and followed her inside. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, exactly the way he liked it. She'd also made Johnny cakes on the cook stove, golden and crispy at the edges, with a precious dollop of butter melting on top. "This is real butter," he said, surprised. "Mrs. Patterson down at the dairy gives me milk and butter in exchange for mending." Marian sat down across from him, moving carefully. "She's got 7 children and no time for needlework. I've got plenty of time and steady hands." "That's good thinking." "It's survival, Mr. Boone. Nothing more complicated than that." She sipped her own coffee, watching him over the rim of her cup. "I've been thinking about what you said last night. About the roof." "Yes, ma'am?" "How long will it really take? And please don't spare my feelings. I need to know the truth." Elias considered this, turning his cup in his hands. "Roof's 3, maybe 4 days if the weather holds. Shutters for those windows, another 2 days. That cistern I mentioned, that's bigger work. Week, maybe more. And I'd need help digging. So we're talking 2 weeks minimum. Probably closer to 3 if we want to do it right. And doing it right is the only way worth doing it." Marian was quiet for a moment, her expression troubled. "Mr. Boone, I can't ask you to give up 3 weeks of your life for someone you don't know." "You're not asking, I'm offering. But your job in Mexico, will still be there in a month, or it won't." He shrugged. "Either way, this work here is more important." "How can you say that? You met me yesterday." Elias set down his cup and looked at her directly, his eyes steady and serious. "Mrs. Hale, I'm going to tell you something my father told me when I was about 15 years old. He said a man's life is made up of choices, and most of those choices don't matter much in the long run. But every now and then you come to a fork in the road, and the choice you make there defines who you are. Not who you were, not who you might be someday. Who you are right now, in that moment." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Yesterday in Fletcher's store, I had one of those choices. I could walk past, mind my own business, head south to Mexico like I planned. Or I could help. And I chose to help. Because that's who I want to be. Man who helps when he can." Marian's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You're a good man, Mr. Boone." "I'm a man trying to be good. There's a difference." He stood, picking up his plate. "Now, if you'll point me toward those tools your husband had, I'll get started on that roof before the sun gets too high." She showed him to a small shed he hadn't noticed the night before, half hidden behind the cabin. Inside, neatly organized despite months of disuse, were Daniel Hale's carpentry tools: a good hammer, several saws, a level, a square, chisels, planes, everything a skilled craftsman would need. "He took care of his tools," Elias observed, running his hand over a saw blade that showed no rust despite the desert air. "Daniel said a carpenter's tools were like a cowboy's horse. You take care of them, they take care of you." Her voice caught slightly on her husband's name. He was right about that. Elias selected what he needed, testing the weight and balance of each tool. These are good, real good. He was a craftsman. Yes, he was. Marian stood in the doorway of the shed, her arms wrapped around herself despite the growing warmth. He could make anything: furniture, cabinets, even musical instruments. Before we came west, he was building a dulcimer for me. Said every home needed music. What happened to it? Sold it in Tucson to pay for the doctor. She said it matter-of-factly, but Elias heard the loss beneath the words. Along with most everything else we owned. He wanted to say something comforting, but empty platitudes had never been his way. Instead, he simply nodded and gathered up the tools. I'll take good care of these. I know you will. The work began in earnest then. Elias climbed up onto the partial roof using a ladder he'd reinforced first thing. Marion had been right that it was dangerous, and assessed the situation. Daniel had gotten about half the shingles on before his death, and had done it right, with proper overlap and secure nailing. The rest of the roof was just exposed beams and battens, covered inadequately with a rotting tarp that wouldn't last another good storm. The lumber Daniel had stockpiled behind the barn was rough-cut pine, not ideal but serviceable. Elias spent the morning measuring and cutting, the rasp of the saw a steady rhythm that seemed to calm something in him. He'd always liked working with wood, the way it smelled, the way it felt under his hands, the satisfaction of seeing raw materials transform into something useful and lasting. By midday, the sun was a hammer beating down on his back, and sweat soaked through his shirt. He climbed down to rest in the shade and found Marion waiting with a bucket of cool water from the creek and a clean rag. "You'll burn yourself to leather if you're not careful," she said, handing him a dipper full of water. "Already am leather, ma'am, but I appreciate the thought." He drank deeply, then dunked the rag in the bucket and wiped his face and neck. "How are you holding up?" "I'm not the one climbing around on a roof in the heat of the day." "No, but you're carrying extra weight in this heat, which is its own kind of hard." He studied her face, noting the shadows under her eyes, the hollow of her cheeks that spoke of long hunger only recently eased. "When's the baby due?" "December. Early part, the doctor thinks, though there's no way to know for sure." "That's good. Gives us time to get this place sealed up tight before the cold really sets in." He paused. "You got anyone who can be with you when your time comes?" Marion looked away, her jaw tight. "There's a midwife in town, Mrs. Henderson. She said she'd come if someone fetched her. And if there's a storm, if the roads are washed out, then I'll manage on my own." Her voice was fierce now, almost angry. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, Mr. Boone. I'll figure it out." "I'm sure you will." He said it gently, not wanting to push. "Just seems like something worth planning for is all. I plan for it every day. Every single day I wake up and think about what might go wrong, what I need to do, how I'll handle it if I'm alone." She pressed a hand to her belly. "But worrying doesn't change anything, does it? So I try not to borrow trouble." "That's wise." "That's exhausting." She managed a small smile. "But it's what I've got." They ate dinner at midday. More beans, some of the dried apples stewed with a little sugar until they were soft and sweet, and fresh bread that Marion had baked in the morning before the heat got too bad. Elias ate with the steady focus of a man used to fueling his body for work, but he noticed things too. The way Marion took small portions, as if still unable to believe the food wouldn't run out. The way she watched him eat with an expression that was part relief and part something harder to define. "You're a good cook," he said, mopping up the last of the bean juice with a piece of bread. "I'm an adequate cook with limited ingredients." But she looked pleased. "My mother tried to teach me fancy cooking back in Ohio. Sauces and soufflés and things made with cream and wine. I never saw the point. Now I wish I'd paid more attention, just so I could make something besides beans and cornbread." "Beans and cornbread kept armies marching through the war. Nothing wrong with them." "You fought?" She asked it carefully, as if uncertain whether the topic was allowed. "Joined up in '63 when I was 16, lied about my age, thought it would be an adventure." His smile was bitter. "Found out different quick enough." Daniel was too young for the war. He used to say it was his one piece of luck, being born in '49 instead of '45. Lucky indeed. Elias stood, stretching muscles that were already starting to stiffen. "I should get back to it. Want to get at least another 6 rows of shingles on before dark." "Mr. Boone?" Marion's voice stopped him at the door. "You don't have to tell me about the war if you don't want to. But if you ever do want to talk about it, I'm a good listener." He looked back at her, this young widow with her own griefs so fresh and heavy, offering to carry some of his. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll keep that in mind." The afternoon wore on, hot and still. Elias worked steadily, the monotony of the task almost meditative. Measure, cut, position, nail. Again and again, each shingle overlapping the one below it, each nail driven true and deep. His hands remembered this work from years past, from the homesteads he'd built in Oklahoma and Kansas and Colorado, always for someone else, always moving on before the final nail was driven. From his vantage point on the roof, he could see the whole of Marion's small claim, the half-built barn, the struggling garden plot, the creek winding through the cottonwoods at the property's edge. It was hardscrabble land, no question about it, but there was potential here. With work and time and enough water, a person could make something of this place. He thought about Mexico, about the job waiting there, about the life he'd imagined for himself. Always moving, always working, never staying long enough to put down roots or make connections that would hurt when they inevitably broke. It had seemed like the smart choice, the safe choice, after losing everyone he'd ever cared about. But watching Marion move around her little homestead far below, hanging laundry on a line strung between two posts, her movements slow but determined, he wondered if safety was worth the loneliness it cost. The sun was starting its descent when he heard the rattle of wagon wheels and the sound of voices. He looked up to see a buckboard approaching, driven by a stout woman in a gingham dress with 3 children piled in the back. Marion heard it too, and came out of the cabin, shading her eyes against the sun. "Mrs. Patterson," she called, "this is a surprise." The woman pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down with the ease of long practice. "Heard some interesting news in town this morning," she said, her voice carrying clearly up to where Elias perched on the roof. "Thought I'd come see for myself if it was true." "I don't know what you heard. That you've got a man living here now. That cowboy who made quite a scene in Fletcher's store yesterday." Mrs. Patterson's eyes found Elias on the roof. "That him?" "Mr. Boone is helping with some repairs." Marion's voice was steady, but Elias could hear the tension in it. "He's kindly staying a few days to get the roof finished." "Staying where exactly?" "In the barn, Mrs. Patterson. Where else would he stay?" The older woman pursed her lips, considering. Her children had climbed out of the wagon and were chasing each other around the yard, their shrieks and laughter cutting through the tension. "Marion, honey, you know I like you. You do good work with that needle of yours. But people are talking. Let them talk. It's not that simple, and you know it." Mrs. Patterson's voice softened. "You're a young widow, about to have a baby, all alone out here. Now there's a strange man living on your property. People are going to draw conclusions. Let them draw whatever conclusions they want." There was steel in Marion's voice now. "Mr. Boone gave me food when I was starving and is fixing my roof so I don't freeze to death this winter. Anyone who wants to make something ugly out of that can go straight to my—" "Marion." Mrs. Patterson looked genuinely shocked. Elias decided it was time to intervene. He climbed down the ladder and walked over, removing his hat as he approached. "Afternoon, ma'am. I'm Elias Boone. I apologize if my presence here has caused Mrs. Hale any trouble. That certainly wasn't my intention." Mrs. Patterson looked him up and down with the assessing eye of a woman who'd spent years evaluating ranch hands and drifters. "What exactly are your intentions, Mr. Boone?" "To fix this roof before the rains come. To make sure Mrs. Hale and her baby have a fighting chance at surviving the winter. Beyond that, ma'am, I don't have any intentions at all." "You expect me to believe you're doing all this out of the goodness of your heart?" "I expect you to believe whatever you choose to believe, ma'am, but the facts are simple. I'm a carpenter by trade, I've got time before my next job, and Mrs. Hale needs help. That's the whole story." The two locked eyes for a long moment. Finally, Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "You seem like a decent man, Mr. Boone, but you have to understand, this is a small community. People talk, and Marion here is already in a vulnerable position. I do understand that, ma'am, which is why I'm working as fast as I can to get this done and be on my way." "See that you do." She turned back to Marion. "I brought you milk and butter like usual. And some eggs. The hens have been laying well this week." "Thank you." Marion's voice was quiet now. "I appreciate it." "I know you do, honey." Mrs. Patterson patted her arm. "Just be careful, all right? Not everyone in town is as understanding as I am." After the woman and her boisterous children had departed, Marion stood in the yard for a long moment, her arms wrapped around herself. Elias approached carefully. "I'm sorry," she said without looking at him. "I should have thought about how it would look, having you here." "Nothing to apologize for." She's right that people will talk. People always talk. They talked when Daniel died, saying he was careless, saying he took unnecessary risks. They talked when I tried to keep farming the land myself, saying I was foolish and stubborn. They'll talk no matter what I do. She finally looked at him, her eyes defiant. I'm tired of making decisions based on what people might say. That's fair. He settled his hat back on his head. But she's also right that you're in a vulnerable position. Last thing you need is for the town to turn against you completely. The town already thinks I'm doomed. They're just waiting to see how long it takes. She walked toward the cabin, her steps heavy. Let them wait. I'm not giving up. Elias watched her go, admiring her spirit even as he worried about the practicality of her situation. Mrs. Patterson's visit had highlighted something he'd been trying not to think about. His presence here, however innocent his intentions, was going to cause Marion problems. He thought about leaving, about saddling his horse and riding out tonight before things got more complicated. But when he looked up at the half-finished roof, at the gaping window frames that would let in wind and rain and snow, at the dozen other things that desperately needed doing before winter came, he knew he couldn't go. Not yet. Not until she was safe. That evening they ate supper in a silence that was no longer quite as comfortable as it had been. Marion picked at her food, her earlier defiance giving way to something that looked like exhaustion. Mrs. Patterson means well, she finally said. She's been kinder to me than most. I could tell. But she's right that people are talking. They always do. She set down her fork. Mr. Boone, if you need to leave, if this is going to cause problems for you, I'll understand. Only problem I've got is that roof being half finished. He met her eyes across the table. I don't care much what people say about me. I've been talked about before, and I'll be talked about again. Question is whether you can afford not to care. I can't afford to care, she said simply. I need this roof fixed more than I need the good opinion of people who've already written me off. All right then. He stood, collecting the dishes. Then we keep working and let the gossips wear themselves out on someone else eventually. Thank you. Her voice was soft. For staying. For everything. That night, as Elias lay in the barn listening to coyotes sing their ancient songs to the stars, he thought about choices and consequences, about the way one decision could ripple outward in unexpected ways. He'd thought helping Marion would be simple. Fix the roof, move on, feel good about having done one decent thing in a world that seemed determined to grind everyone down to dust. But nothing was ever simple, was it? People were complicated. Situations were complicated. And the truth was, somewhere between Fletcher's store and this moment, something had shifted in him. Marion Hale wasn't just a widow who needed help anymore. She was becoming a person he cared about, whose struggles mattered to him in a way that went beyond simple Christian charity. That thought should have scared him, should have sent him running for his horse in the open road, but instead it settled in his chest like a warm coal, glowing softly in the darkness. The next morning brought clouds, great billowing masses of them piling up over the mountains to the east. Elias took one look at the sky and doubled his pace, knowing that the monsoon storms could come with almost no warning this time of year. He was right. By mid-afternoon, the first rumbles of thunder were rolling across the desert like the hoofbeats of some massive, invisible herd. The wind picked up, hot and dry at first, then suddenly cool and damp, carrying the smell of rain. "Mr. Boone," Marion called from below. "You need to come down. It's not safe up there." "Just one more section." He worked frantically, nailing down shingles as fast as his hands could move. If he could just get this section covered, it would protect the interior from the worst of the storm. The first drops hit like bullets, big and cold, and hard enough to sting. Then the sky opened up, and the world disappeared in a gray wall of water. Elias scrambled down the ladder, nearly slipping on the wet rungs. Marion grabbed his arm as he reached the ground, pulling him toward the cabin. They burst through the door just as lightning cracked directly overhead, close enough that the thunder was instantaneous, a physical force that rattled the windows, or would have if there had been windows instead of just shutters. They stood dripping on the floor, breathing hard, as rain hammered the roof like thousands of tiny fists. Elias looked up, listening intently, tracing the sound of water. "It's holding," he said, relief evident in his voice. "The part I finished is holding. Of course it is. Marion was wringing out her skirt. You do good work, Mr. Boone. A steady drip started from the unfinished section, falling into a bucket Marion quickly positioned. Then another drip and another. Soon there were 4 buckets scattered around the room, each catching its own stream of water, each adding its own note to the symphony of the storm. Well, Elias said, pulling off his soaked shirt and hanging it near the stove, at least it's just drips and not a flood. Yet. But Marion was smiling. Though I suppose drips are an improvement over what we had before, which was basically a sieve. The storm raged for hours, the rain so heavy that the world beyond the cabin walls became nothing but sound and fury. They sat at the small table, drinking coffee and listening to the drums of water on wood, on earth, on everything. I love this, Marion said suddenly. The storms. Daniel thought I was crazy, but I've always loved them, the power of it, the way it makes you feel small and safe all at once if you're inside looking out. I know what you mean. Elias watched rain sheet past the window opening. It's like the world is washing itself clean, starting over. Exactly. She wrapped her hands around her cup. When I was a girl in Ohio, I used to sit on our porch during thunderstorms and watch the lightning. My mother said I'd be struck dead for tempting fate, but I never could help myself. There was something about it that felt true, I guess, like nature being honest about what it is. Honest is a good word for it. A storm doesn't pretend to be anything but what it is. They fell silent, listening. After a while, Marion said, "Tell me about your sister, Sarah, if you want to." Elias was quiet for so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, she was 4 years younger than me. Stubborn as a mule, kind as summer rain. Married a farmer named Tom Patterson, no relation to your Mrs. Patterson, when she was 17. Had 2 babies by the time she was 20. What happened to her? 3rd baby came early. Tom was 10 miles away, helping a neighbor with a barn raising when Sarah's time came. By the time someone rode out to fetch him, it was too late. Baby died. Sarah died 2 days later from the bleeding. His voice was matter-of-fact, but his hands were tight around his cup. I was in Kansas working cattle. Didn't even know she was pregnant. Got a letter 3 weeks after she was buried. I'm so sorry. Me too. He looked up at her. That's why when I saw you in Fletcher's store, I couldn't walk away. You looked like Sarah did in the last letter she sent me, trying to be strong, trying not to ask for help, but needing it desperately. I wasn't there for her, but I was there for you. It seemed like maybe that meant something. Marion reached across the table and took his hand. It was the first time she'd touched him intentionally, and the contact sent something warm through both of them. Not romantic, not yet, but a recognition of shared grief, of understanding. It means everything, she said quietly. You saved my life, Mr. Boone, and my baby's life. That means everything. They sat like that as the storm raged outside, 2 people who'd lost too much finding a moment of peace in the midst of chaos. The rain drummed on, the buckets filled and were emptied and filled again, and slowly, gradually, the world began to lighten as the storm passed. By evening, the rain had softened to a gentle patter, and the air coming through the window openings was cool and clean, scrubbed free of dust. Elias went out to check on his horse and found the animal standing patiently in the partial shelter of the barn, wet but unharmed. You're a good boy, he murmured, rubbing the horse's nose. Best horse I've ever had, and that's the truth. When he returned to the cabin, Marion had lit lamps against the gathering darkness and was stirring something on the stove that smelled like heaven, onions and salt pork and beans, simple but rich. One of Mrs. Patterson's chickens got into my old garden plot, she said without turning around. I chased it out but found 3 eggs it had hidden in the weeds, so tonight we're having a feast. The eggs were scrambled with little bits of salt pork, served alongside the beans and fresh cornbread. They ate slowly, savoring every bite, and afterward Elias insisted on washing the dishes while Marion sat with her feet up. I used to do this with Sarah, he found himself saying. After Tom was out working the fields, she and I would clean up from supper and talk about everything and nothing. She'd tell me about the babies, about Tom, about her plans for the farm. I'd tell her about whatever trail drive or ranch job I was working. It was comfortable. Like this. I'm glad, Marion said softly. I'm glad we can give you some of that back. Me too, Mrs. Hale. Me too. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Elias would wake with the sun, work on the roof until the heat became unbearable, rest during the worst of the midday sun, then work until dark. Marian cooked, mended, maintained what she could of the garden, and slowly, gradually began to look less like a woman starving and more like a woman simply tired. They talked during meals, sharing stories from their very different lives. Elias learned that Marian had been a teacher before she married, that she loved poetry and music, that she'd left Ohio against her family's wishes to come west with Daniel because she believed in his dreams of building something from nothing. Marian learned that Elias had never stayed in one place longer than a season since the war ended, that he was secretly a voracious reader who'd worn out 2 copies of Shakespeare's complete works, that he played harmonica but hadn't touched his since Sarah died because music reminded him too much of everything he'd lost. You should play again, she said one evening. Music is for remembering, not forgetting. Maybe, he said, someday. By the end of the second week, the roof was finished, completely, professionally, as weather-tight as any roof in the territory. Elias stood back and looked at it with satisfaction, wiping sweat from his brow. That'll hold, he said, through rain, snow, whatever winter throws at it. Marian stood beside him, her hand shading her eyes as she looked up. It's beautiful, she said, and her voice caught on the word. Daniel would be proud. It was his design. I just finished what he started. No, she turned to him. You gave us a future. That's more than finishing. That's hope. The next project was the window shutters, which went faster now that Elias knew the cabin's quirks and had the tools arranged to his liking. He built them sturdy, with good hinges and strong latches, so they could be closed against storms or opened to let in light and air as needed. While he worked, Marian surprised him by starting to tackle the barn herself. Not the building, which was beyond her in her condition, but the organization of it. She swept out months of accumulated dirt and debris, arranged the tools properly, created a space that was actually habitable rather than just shelter from the elements. You didn't have to do all this, Elias said, when he came to put away his saw one evening and found the barn transformed. Yes, I did. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. You're giving me so much. I needed to give something back. Mrs. Hale, Marian, she said it firmly. We've been living on the same property for 2 weeks now, Mr. Boone. I think we can use first names. Elias, he said and smiled. Nice to properly meet you, Marian. Nice to properly meet you, Elias. They stood there in the clean barn, surrounded by organized tools and sweet-smelling hay Marian had somehow bartered for, and something shifted again. The formality that had kept them at a safe distance began to crack, letting in something warmer, more dangerous, more real. That night, Elias lay awake long after he should have been sleeping, listening to the sounds of the desert night and thinking about the choices he'd made, the ones he was making and the ones that were coming. Mexico seemed very far away now, and the idea of leaving seemed complicated. He told himself it was just because the work wasn't finished. The cistern still needed to be dug, the barn still needed walls and a roof. There were a dozen other things that needed doing before winter came and before Marian's time arrived. But he knew, even as he told himself these things, that the truth was more complicated. The truth was that he'd started to care. About the cabin, yes, and about the work, but mostly about the woman who lived here and the child she was carrying and the future they were trying to build from the rubble of their losses. And caring, as he'd learned the hard way, was the most dangerous thing a drifter could do. The morning Elias started digging the cistern, the sky was pale as old bone, and the air carried the first real hint of autumn, a coolness that lingered even after the sun rose, promising that summer's brutal grip was finally beginning to loosen. He'd spent the previous evening pacing out the best location, settling on a spot near the cabin where the ground sloped naturally toward the creek, but was high enough to avoid flooding. This is going to be hard work, Marian said, watching him mark out a circle in the dirt with stakes and string. You'll need help. I'll manage. Elias. She used his first name now, without hesitation, and the sound of it still did something strange to his chest each time. You can't dig a cistern alone. It's too much for one man, and you know it. He did know it. A proper cistern needed to be at least 8 feet deep and 6 feet across, lined with stones to keep the walls from collapsing and the water clean. It was backbreaking work even with help, nearly impossible alone. I could ask around in town, he said reluctantly. See if anyone's willing to work for day wages. Who in town would work for a woman who's got a cowboy living in her barn? Marion's voice was dry. Mrs. Patterson's visit 2 weeks ago started tongues wagging. By now, half of Tucson probably thinks we're living in sin, and the other half thinks I've lost my mind. That's not fair to you. Life's not fair, Elias. We both know that. She adjusted her shawl against the morning chill, one hand resting on her belly where the baby was visibly larger now, making itself known with frequent kicks and movements. But I think I know someone who might help. Tom Bridger. Who's that? He owns the claim adjacent to this one, about 2 miles west. He's different, keeps to himself mostly, but Daniel helped him repair his wagon wheel once, and Tom said he owed us a favor. Worth trying, I suppose. Elias wiped his hands on his pants. You know how to get there? I can draw you a map. But when Elias rode out an hour later, following Marion's carefully sketched directions, he found that Tom Bridger wasn't what he'd expected. The man who emerged from a dugout shelter carved into the side of a hill was somewhere past 50, with long gray hair tied back in a leather cord and eyes the color of winter sky. He wore buckskin pants and a cotton shirt, and his face bore the weathered lines of someone who'd spent decades under the western sun. You're the cowboy staying with the Hale widow, Bridger said without preamble. Heard about you. News travels fast. News travels the only speed it knows. Bridger studied him with unsettling intensity. What do you want? Mrs. Hale said you might be willing to help dig a cistern. I can pay. Don't want your money. Bridger turned and walked back toward his dugout. But I owed Daniel Hale a debt. Figure I can transfer that debt to his widow. When do we start? Tomorrow morning? Dawn, bring coffee. Bridger paused at his doorway. You planning on staying after the cistern's done? I don't know. You should. And with that cryptic statement, Bridger disappeared into his home, leaving Elias standing in the dusty yard wondering what exactly he'd just agreed to. Tom Bridger arrived the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the mountains, riding a mule and carrying his own tools. He nodded to Elias, accepted a cup of the coffee Marion had made strong enough to float horseshoes, and set to work without another word. The man was a machine. Despite his age, he could swing a pickaxe for hours without tiring, his movements economical and precise. Elias found himself working harder just to keep pace, and by midday both men were soaked with sweat despite the cooling weather. Marion brought them water and food at intervals, and Elias noticed the way Bridger spoke to her, respectfully, but with a gentleness that suggested he knew what it was to lose someone. When she mentioned Daniel, Bridger nodded. He was a good man, Bridger said simply, deserved better than what he got. Yes, he did. Marion's voice was steady, but Elias saw her hand tighten on her shawl. But I'm grateful for the time we had. That's the right way to think about it. Bridger drained his cup and stood. Most folks waste time on anger. Better to be grateful for what was and work toward what might be. They dug for 5 days straight, carving into the hard desert earth with picks and shovels, hauling bucket after bucket of dirt and rock. The hole grew deeper, and as it did, Bridger taught Elias the tricks of the trade. How to angle the walls just right to prevent collapse. How to identify the layer of clay that would hold water best. How to judge when they'd gone deep enough. On the 4th day, while they were taking a break in the shade, Bridger finally spoke more than a few words at a stretch. You care about her, he said, not quite making it a question. Elias took a long drink of water before answering. She needed help. That's not what I asked. I know what you asked. Elias set down his cup. And I don't know the answer. I care about her the way any decent person would care about someone in trouble. Beyond that, he shrugged. You're lying to yourself. Bridger said it without judgment, just stating a fact. Seen it before. Man tells himself he's just being helpful, just doing the right thing, all while his heart's making decisions his head doesn't want to admit to. Even if that were true, and I'm not saying it is, What difference does it make? She's a widow. She's pregnant with another man's child. She's got no reason to want anything to do with a drifter like me. You think she looks at you like you're just some helpful drifter? Bridger smiled slightly. You're more blind than I thought. Elias wanted to argue, but something in Bridger's expression stopped him. Instead, he asked, How do you know so much about this? Had a wife once, lost her to cholera back in '52, spent 15 years telling myself I was fine alone, that I didn't need anybody, that caring too much just led to hurt. Bridger picked up his pickaxe. Then one day I woke up and realized I'd wasted 15 years being too scared to try again. Don't make my mistake, Cowboy. Life's too short and too hard to spend it running from the possibility of happiness. They finished the cistern on the 5th day, lining it with carefully selected stones that Bridger somehow knew would hold without mortar. When they were done, they stood at the edge looking down at their work, both exhausted and satisfied. That'll serve her well, Bridger said, through dry years and wet. You did good work. We did good work. Yeah, we did. Bridger offered his hand and Elias shook it. You need help with anything else? You send word. I'll come. Thank you for everything. Thank Daniel. I'm just paying a debt. Bridger mounted his mule, then paused. But for what it's worth, I think you're good for each other, her and you. Just don't wait too long to figure that out. After Bridger left, Elias stood alone in the yard, looking at the cabin with its finished roof and proper shutters, at the cistern that would hold water through the winter, at all the work they'd accomplished together. He'd been here nearly a month now, and the place looked transformed, still rough, still unfinished in places, but no longer desperate, no longer doomed. Marian came out of the cabin, moving more slowly now as her pregnancy advanced. She looked at the cistern, then at him, and smiled with such genuine happiness that it hurt something in his chest. It's perfect, she said. She adds, Elias, it's absolutely perfect. Bridger did most of it. No, you both did it. Together. She moved to stand beside him. I can't believe how much has changed in just a few weeks. This place, it looks like a real home now. It is a real home. You made it that. They stood together in the afternoon sun, and Elias was acutely aware of her presence beside him, of the way her shoulder almost touched his arm, of how natural it felt to be standing here with her like this. There's a harvest dance in town next week, Marian said suddenly, her voice careful. Mrs. Patterson mentioned it when she brought milk yesterday. She said... She paused, then continued in a rush. She said it would be good for me to go, to show people I'm not hiding out here in shame or fear. That's probably wise. Would you... She stopped, took a breath. Would you consider coming with me? I know it's asking a lot and people will talk even more, but I don't want to go alone and you're my friend. I think. I hope. Friend. The word should have been safe, comfortable. Instead, it felt insufficient in a way Elias couldn't quite articulate. I'd be honored, he said quietly. But Marian, you should know that me going with you will make the gossip worse, not better. I know, but I'm tired of making decisions based on gossip. She turned to face him fully. The truth is, I want you there. Not because I need an escort or because I'm afraid, but because you've become important to me and I want to share this with you, even if it's just a country dance in a dusty town hall. The honesty in her voice made something crack open in Elias's carefully constructed defenses. Then I'll be there, he said. Gossip be damned. Her smile was worth every word he'd ever spoken. The week before the dance passed in a blur of final preparations. Elias worked on smaller projects, fixing the porch steps, reinforcing the chicken coop Marian had bartered for, building a proper door for the barn. Marian spent her time cleaning and organizing, and one afternoon Elias came in to find her standing before her small mirror, holding up a faded blue dress with an expression of dismay. What's wrong? He asked. This is the only nice dress I have left, she said. Everything else I sold or wore out. But look at it. It's patched in 3 places, the hem is coming down, and even if I fix it, it's not going to fit anymore. She pressed a hand to her belly. I've grown since Daniel died. The baby's grown. Nothing fits right. Elias studied the dress, thinking. You said you used to do mending for Mrs. Patterson. I still do. Why? Because you're good with a needle. And Daniel left fabric. I saw it in that chest in the corner. What if you made something new? I can't make a dress in a week. Why not? You've got the skills, you've got the material, and I've got 2 hands that can help with whatever you need. He smiled. My mother taught me to sew. Not fancy work, but I can manage a straight seam if you guide me. The idea seemed to spark something in Marian. She went to the chest and pulled out a length of blue calico that Daniel had bought months ago, intending it for curtains that had never been made. It was simple but pretty, with a small flower pattern that caught the light. It would work, she said slowly, if I'm careful with the measurements, if I plan it right. Then let's plan it right. Over the next 3 days, Marian worked on the dress with an intensity that spoke of how much it meant to her. She cut the pattern from an old dress, adjusting for her changed figure, and pieced it together with tiny, perfect stitches. Elias helped where he could, holding fabric taut, threading needles, offering opinions when asked. You're good at this, Marian said one evening as they worked by lamplight. Your mother taught you well. She said every person should know how to mend what they own. Made me and Sarah both learn to cook, sew, keep house. Said she wouldn't raise children who couldn't take care of themselves. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was. Elias finished the seam he was working on and held it up for inspection. Lost her to fever when I was 19. Pa went 6 months later. Couldn't live without her, I think. Just gave up. That's heartbreaking. It's love. He said it simply. The real kind. The kind that means when one person goes, the other person's not whole anymore. Marian was quiet for a moment, her needle moving steadily through the fabric. Daniel and I had that, she finally said. Or at least I thought we did. We were only married a year, but it was a good year. A happy year, despite how hard everything was. I'm glad you had that time together. So am I, but sometimes I wonder. She stopped, shook her head. Never mind, it's foolish. Tell me anyway. I wonder if I'm allowed to feel happy again. If it's a betrayal somehow, to laugh or enjoy something, or look forward to the future when Daniel's not here to share it. She set down her sewing. Is that terrible? No. Elias moved closer, his voice gentle. It's human. But Marian, I don't think Daniel would want you to stop living just because he couldn't keep living. I think he'd want you to raise that baby, make a good life, find joy where you can. You didn't know him. No, but I know what I'd want if I were him. I'd want the woman I love to survive, to thrive, to be happy. He paused, even if that happiness eventually included someone else. Their eyes met across the lamplight, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that neither was quite ready to name but could no longer completely deny. The dress is beautiful, Elias said, breaking the moment. You should be proud. I am. Marian picked up her needle again. Thank you for helping, for everything. The night of the dance arrived cool and clear, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. Marian emerged from the cabin in her new blue dress, and Elias felt his breath catch. The dress fit her perfectly, accommodating her pregnancy while somehow making her look elegant rather than awkward. She'd done something to her hair too, pinning it up in a way that showed the graceful line of her neck. You look beautiful, he said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. Thank you. She was nervous, he could tell. Her hands kept smoothing the fabric of her skirt. I feel like I'm going to battle instead of a dance. In a way you are, but you're not going alone. He helped her up into the wagon, and they set out for town under the rising moon. The ride took almost an hour, and they spent it talking about inconsequential things, the weather, the latest news from Mrs. Patterson, whether the chickens would survive the winter. Neither mentioned the undercurrent of tension, the knowledge that tonight would be a test of sorts, a public declaration that Marian Hale was not ashamed of her circumstances or the cowboy who'd helped her survive them. The town hall was lit up like a lantern, music spilling out into the night, fiddles and guitars, a harmonica, someone keeping rhythm on a washboard. The sound was joyful and inviting, and for a moment Elias let himself imagine that they were just 2 people going to a dance, not a pregnant widow and a drifter about to walk into a den of gossip. But the moment they stepped through the door, the music stuttered and conversations died. Every eye in the place turned toward them, and Elias felt Marion stiffen beside him. He offered her his arm, and after a moment she took it, holding her head high as they walked further into the room. Mrs. Patterson was there with her husband, and she hurried over with a smile that seemed genuine. "Marion, you look wonderful. And Mr. Boone, so glad you could make it." "Thank you for the invitation," Marion said, her voice steady despite the weight of all those watching eyes. The music started up again, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. Couples moved onto the dance floor, and the normal buzz of conversation gradually resumed, though Elias noticed how many people kept glancing their way. "Would you like to dance?" he asked Marion quietly. "I don't know if I should. The baby—" "One dance, slow and careful. If you feel uncomfortable, we'll stop." She nodded, and he led her onto the floor as the fiddler struck up a waltz. Elias placed his hand carefully on her back, mindful of her condition, and they began to move together to the music. "Everyone's staring," Marion whispered. "Let them stare. You deserve to be here. You deserve to dance and smile and enjoy yourself." "It's been so long since I danced. Daniel and I used to dance in the cabin sometimes when he'd finished work for the day. He'd hum the tune since we didn't have music, and we'd waltz around that tiny space until we were both laughing too hard to continue." "That sounds like a good memory." "It is." She looked up at him, her eyes bright. "Thank you for this, Elias. For making me feel like a person again instead of just a burden or a tragedy. You were never either of those things." They danced until the song ended, and then another couple approached. A weathered rancher named Jensen and his wife, both of whom Elias recognized from his brief trips into town for supplies. "Mrs. Hale," Jensen said with a small bow. "My wife and I wanted to tell you that your husband once did some repair work for us, and he wouldn't take payment. Said neighbors should help neighbors. We've been meaning to return the favor, and we wondered if you might need anything, lumber, supplies, help with the stock come winter." Marion looked stunned. "That's very kind of you. Yes, I could use help when the time comes." "Thank you." "Our pleasure, ma'am." Jensen nodded to Elias. "You're the one who fixed her roof?" "Yes, sir." "Good work, I hear. If you're looking for employment once you're finished with Mrs. Hale's place, I could use a hand at my ranch. Pays fair and the work's steady." "I appreciate that, sir. I'll keep it in mind." After the Jensens moved away, Marion turned to Elias with wonder in her eyes. "Did that just happen?" "Seems like it. I thought everyone in this town had written me off." "Maybe not everyone." Elias glanced around the room and saw that while some people were still shooting them judgmental looks, others seemed simply curious or even approving. "You survived, Marion. You fought to keep your home and your dignity. People respect that, even if they don't always know how to show it." The evening continued in a similar vein. Some people kept their distance, but others made a point of speaking to Marion, offering condolences for Daniel and congratulations on the baby, asking after her health and her plans. It wasn't universal acceptance, but it was something, a crack in the wall of isolation she'd been living behind. When it came time for supper, they found seats at one of the long tables, and Mrs. Patterson made sure their plates were filled with roasted chicken, potatoes, beans, and pie. Elias ate with appreciation, but he noticed that Marion mostly pushed her food around, too overwhelmed by the social interaction to have much appetite. "You should eat," he said quietly. "For the baby." "I know, She pressed a hand to her belly. "I can't believe how different this is from what I expected. I thought they'd shun us, or worse. Some of them wanted to. But you didn't give them the chance. You walked in here with your head high and showed them you're not ashamed of anything you've done." "I'm not ashamed, but I am scared." She finally looked at him fully. "What happens when you leave, Elias? When you go to Mexico or wherever the next job takes you? I'll be alone again, and the winter will come, and the baby will come, and—" "Hey!" He covered her hand with his. "Don't borrow trouble, remember? We'll figure it out when the time comes." But even as he said it, Elias realized that he'd been avoiding that same question for weeks now. What happened when he left? Because he would have to leave eventually, wouldn't he? He'd never stayed anywhere longer than a season. He had no land, no home, no prospects beyond his ability to work. He was 34 years old with nothing to his name but a horse, a gun, and the clothes on his back. What did he have to offer someone like Marion, who deserved stability and security and a future she could count on? The music changed, becoming slower, sweeter. Couples moved onto the floor again, and Elias saw the longing in Marion's face as she watched them. "One more dance," he said, standing and offering his hand. "Before we head home." She took it, and they moved onto the floor again. This time, other couples made space for them, and the fiddler played something soft and gentle, a tune that spoke of autumn evenings and harvest moons and the bittersweet passage of time. Elias held Marion carefully, feeling the swell of her belly between them, the baby that was the last piece of Daniel Hale left in this world. He felt her heartbeat through the fabric of her dress, steady and strong, and he felt his own heart answer it with a rhythm that was becoming dangerously familiar. "Elias," she whispered as they swayed to the music, "I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for weeks and could no longer contain them. "I know it's too soon, I know it's wrong, that I should still be mourning Daniel, that you're probably going to leave, that this is all impossible. But I can't help it, and I thought you should know." Elias stopped moving, standing still in the middle of the dance floor while other couples swirled around them. He looked down at her upturned face, at the tears gathering in her eyes, at the courage it had taken to speak those words. "Marion, you don't have to say anything," she continued quickly. "I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to be honest with you, because you've been so honest with me, and—" He kissed her. It was gentle, brief, nothing that would scandalize the townspeople watching, but it was real. When he pulled back, her eyes were wide with shock. "I'm falling in love with you too," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "Have been for weeks, probably. I just didn't know how to say it, or if I should say it, or what it means for either of us." "What does it mean?" "I don't know yet, but I know I don't want to leave. I know that the thought of riding away from here, from you, makes me feel like I'm abandoning the only thing that's mattered in years." They stood together on the dance floor, the music washing over them, people watching but neither of them caring anymore. Marion reached up and touched his face, her hand gentle against his weathered cheek. "Then don't leave," she whispered. "Stay, not just until the work is done or until the baby comes. Stay because you want to. Stay because I want you to. Stay because maybe we can build something together. I don't have anything to offer you, no money, no land. You have yourself, your hands, your heart, your strength. That's more than enough." She smiled through her tears. "We'll figure out the rest together." The music ended and reality came crashing back. They were standing in the middle of the Tucson town hall, having just kissed in front of half the town, and the gossip mill was undoubtedly already churning out theories and judgments at full speed. But when Elias looked around, expecting to see shock or disapproval, he saw something more complicated. Some people were frowning, yes, but others were smiling, and Mrs. Patterson was beaming like she'd orchestrated the whole thing herself. They left soon after, both overwhelmed by what had just happened. The wagon ride home was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet now, the kind that comes from understanding rather than uncertainty. Marion sat close beside Elias on the bench, her shoulder touching his, and he kept one arm around her to steady her on the rough road. When they reached the cabin, he helped her down from the wagon with extra care, and they stood together in the moonlit yard, neither quite ready for the evening to end. "So," Marion finally said, "what happens now?" "Now we take it one day at a time. We finish getting ready for winter. We prepare for the baby. We figure out what kind of life we can build here, together." "Together," she repeated, testing the word. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." He touched her face gently. "But Marion, you need to understand. I'm not Daniel. I can't replace him, and I'm not going to try. He was your husband, the father of your child, and he deserves to be remembered and honored. I know that. And I'm not asking you to be Daniel. I'm asking you to be Elias, to be the man who saved my life and fixed my roof and taught me that it's possible to care about someone new without forgetting someone old." He pulled her close, carefully mindful of her belly, and held her in the moonlight. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang its lonesome song. The desert wind whispered through the mesquite, carrying the promise of winter on its breath. "I'll stay," Elias said finally. "For as long as you'll have me. I'll stay and we'll make this work somehow. That's all I'm asking for, just a chance to try." They stood together a while longer, then Elias walked her to the cabin door. She paused there, turning back to him. "Thank you for tonight, for the dance, for your honesty, for—" She gestured helplessly. "For everything. Thank you for taking a chance on a drifter cowboy who didn't know he was looking for a home until he found one." She smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Then she went inside, closing the door softly behind her. Elias walked back to the barn, his mind spinning with everything that had happened. He'd come to Tucson planning to buy supplies and keep moving. Instead, he'd found a purpose, a place, and against all odds, the beginning of love. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. As he bedded down for the night, he thought about Tom Bridger's words. Life's too short and too hard to spend it running from the possibility of happiness. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to plant roots, even if those roots were shallow and uncertain. Maybe it was time to believe that a drifter and a widow could build something lasting from the broken pieces of their pasts. Outside, the moon set slowly and the stars blazed cold and bright in the desert sky. Inside the barn, Elias slept more peacefully than he had in years, dreaming of a future that was no longer empty and alone. And in the cabin, Marian lay with one hand on her belly and the other clutching the blue fabric of her new dress, allowing herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, life was giving her a second chance at happiness. The night deepened and the desert settled into its patient quiet, holding within it two people who had found each other when both had thought themselves beyond finding. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new steps on a path neither had expected to walk. But tonight, there was just the peaceful darkness and the knowledge that neither of them was alone anymore. And in a hard land where loneliness was as common as dust and hope was as rare as rain, that was enough of a miracle to carry them through whatever came next. The days following the harvest dance carried a different quality, as if the air itself had changed texture. Elias woke each morning with a sense of purpose that went beyond simple work, beyond obligation. He was building a future now, not just repairing a past, and the difference settled into his bones like warmth after a long winter. Marian felt it too. She moved through her days with lighter steps despite the growing weight of her pregnancy, humming songs she hadn't remembered knowing, finding reasons to smile at small things, the way sunlight caught in the new window shutters, the sound of Elias's hammer ringing clear in the morning air, the taste of coffee shared across the table. But change, even good change, rarely came without cost. 3 days after the dance, Cyrus Fletcher appeared in their yard, driving a wagon loaded with lumber. Elias was working on the barn, and he straightened slowly when he saw who it was, his hand instinctively checking that his gun was within reach. Not that he expected trouble exactly, but Fletcher had proven himself a man of uncertain character. "Mr. Fletcher," Elias called out, his tone neutral. "What brings you out here?" Fletcher climbed down from his wagon with the careful movements of a man who spent more time behind a counter than in a saddle. His face was carefully composed into an expression of businesslike pleasantness that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Boone, Mrs. Hale," he nodded as Marian emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. "I hope I'm not intruding." "That depends on what you want," Marian said, her voice cool. She hadn't forgotten how he'd tried to cheat her, and the memory stood between them like a wall. "I came to apologize." Fletcher's words came out stiff, as if they'd been rehearsed. "For how I treated you that day in my store. It was ungentlemanly, and I've been troubled by it ever since." "Have you?" Marian's tone suggested she didn't believe him for a second. "I have, and I wanted to make amends." Fletcher gestured to the lumber in his wagon. "This is good pine, freshly milled. Enough to finish your barn, I'd reckon. Consider it my way of saying sorry." Elias exchanged a glance with Marian, seeing his own suspicion reflected in her eyes. "That's generous, Mr. Fletcher. What's the catch?" "No catch." But Fletcher shifted his weight, betraying his discomfort. "Though I'll admit, I've heard talk in town about you two, and I figure if folks are going to gossip, They might as well gossip about something true rather than making up stories. What kind of stories? Marian asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. The kind that come from a pregnant widow and an unmarried man living on the same property. Fletcher had the grace to look embarrassed. I'm not saying I agree with the talk, mind you. I'm just saying that folks will talk regardless. And sometimes the best way to stop gossip is to give them nothing to gossip about. And how exactly would we do that? Elias's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Well, I couldn't help but notice at the dance that you two seem fond of each other. And I thought, that is, some of us in town thought, that if you were to make things official, get married proper before the baby comes, it would quiet the tongues and make things easier for everyone. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Marian's face had gone pale, then red, and Elias could see her hands trembling slightly as they gripped her apron. Let me make sure I understand, she said, her voice dangerously level. You came out here to bribe us into marriage with lumber? To make your town more comfortable with a situation that's none of their business? Now, Mrs. Hale, that's exactly what you're doing. Marian's composure cracked and fury blazed through. You tried to rob me when I was starving. You stood by and watched me beg for food with my dead husband's ring. And now you have the audacity to come here and tell me how to live my life so that you and your gossiping friends can sleep better at night? I was just trying to help. Help, Marian's voice rose. You want to help? Then take your lumber and your opinions and get off my property. And you can tell everyone in Tucson that Marian Hale doesn't need their approval to live her life or make her choices. Fletcher's face darkened with anger. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Hale. People in this town have long memories. You might find yourself in need of help someday, and nobody willing to give it. Then I'll manage on my own, just like I've been doing. Marian stood straight despite her pregnancy, every inch of her radiating defiance. Now leave. Fletcher climbed back into his wagon, his movements jerky with suppressed rage. You're a fool, he said to Elias, tying yourself to a woman with another man's baby and a property that'll never amount to anything. You could do better. No, Elias said quietly, walking to stand beside Marian. I really couldn't. They watched Fletcher drive away, his wagon rattling over the rough ground, taking his lumber and his conditional charity with him. When he was out of sight, Marian let out a long, shaking breath. I'm sorry, she said. I shouldn't have lost my temper like that. We might have needed that lumber. We'll get lumber somewhere else. Elias put his arm around her shoulders. And you had every right to lose your temper. What he suggested was insulting. Was it, though? Marian turned to face him, her eyes searching his face. I mean, the way he said it was terrible, but the underlying idea, is it so wrong? People will talk, Elias. They already are. And when the baby comes, it's only going to get worse. Let them talk. Easy for you to say. You're not the one who will be called a scarlet woman. You're not the one whose child will grow up hearing whispers about their mother's virtue. Elias was quiet for a moment, understanding the weight of what she was saying. A man could weather gossip and judgment with relative ease, but a woman, especially one alone with a child, could be destroyed by it. What are you saying? He asked carefully. I'm saying that maybe Fletcher had a point, even if he made it badly. If we're going to be together, and I want us to be together, Elias, I truly do, then maybe we should think about making it official. Not because the town demands it, but because it's the right thing for us, for the baby, for our future. Marian. He took her hands in his. I won't marry you because some shopkeeper with delusions of propriety thinks we should. If we get married, it has to be because we both want it, for our own reasons, in our own time. And do you want it? The question was almost a whisper. Elias thought about it honestly, examining his feelings with the care they deserved. Did he want to marry Marian? 6 weeks ago, he would have said the very idea was impossible. He was a drifter, a man with no roots and no prospects, unsuited for the kind of permanence that marriage required. But now, standing in the yard of a half-built homestead with a pregnant widow whose strength and courage had captured his heart, the idea didn't seem impossible at all. It seemed inevitable, like a destination he'd been traveling toward without knowing it. Yes, he said finally. I want it. Not today, not because Fletcher said we should, But yes, I want to marry you. I want to raise that baby with you. I want to build this life with you and see where it takes us. Marian's eyes filled with tears. Even though the baby isn't yours, the baby will be mine if I'm the one raising them. Blood doesn't make a father, Marian. Love does. Showing up does. Being there when it matters does. He touched her belly gently. This child will know Daniel was their father, and we'll make sure they know he was a good man who loved them before he ever met them. But I can be a father too, if you'll let me. Oh, Elias. She was crying now, but smiling through the tears. Yes, I'll let you. I want you to. They held each other in the autumn sunshine, and something that had been uncertain became certain. Something that had been possible became real. When they finally pulled apart, Marian wiped her eyes and laughed a little at herself. Look at me crying like a foolish girl. Daniel used to tease me about how easily I cried, happy or sad. Said I cried at everything from weddings to rainstorms. It's not foolish. It's feeling things deeply, and there's nothing wrong with that. Still, I should save some tears for the actual proposal. She looked at him with mock sternness. Because you haven't actually asked me properly yet, Elias Boone. He laughed, surprised and delighted by her teasing. You're right. I haven't. He glanced around the yard at the half-finished barn and the completed cabin, at the cistern and the garden plot and all the work they'd done together. This doesn't seem like the right place somehow. Give me a few days to figure out how to do this properly. You don't have to make it fancy. I know I don't have to, but I want to. You deserve to be asked properly, Marian. Not because some busybody thinks we should get married, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. The tenderness in his voice made her breath catch. All right, she said softly. I'll wait. But Elias? Don't wait too long. This baby's not going to wait for perfect timing. He smiled. I won't. I promise. The next few days passed in a strange limbo of anticipation and ordinary work. Elias threw himself into finishing the barn, working long hours to make up for the lumber Fletcher had taken away. Tom Bridger heard about the incident. News traveled fast in a small community and showed up with his mule and a load of rough-cut timber. Heard you might need this, was all he said, unloading the wood without ceremony. How much do I owe you? Elias asked. Nothing. Consider it a wedding present. We're not married yet. Bridger gave him a look that suggested he was being deliberately obtuse. Yet being the important word. Don't be stupid about this, Boone. Ask her properly, and get it done before winter sets in hard. Yes, sir, Elias said, fighting a smile. And make it good. Woman like that deserves a proper proposal, not just, hey, want to get hitched? While you're hauling water or mucking out the barn. I'm working on it. Work faster. But Bridger's gruff words were softened by the hint of a smile. Life's short. Don't waste time on hesitation when you know what you want. Elias took the advice to heart. He thought about how to ask Marian properly, how to make it meaningful and real. He couldn't offer her diamonds or a fancy restaurant or any of the things a woman might expect in a normal courtship. But he could offer her honesty and intention and a promise made under open sky. The opportunity came 3 days later, on an evening when the autumn air was cool and clear, and the sunset painted the desert in shades of copper and gold. Elias had been working on something in secret, and when he came to the cabin as darkness fell, he asked Marian if she'd walk with him. Walk where? She asked, puzzled but amused. You'll see. Bring a shawl, it's getting cold. He led her not toward the barn or the cistern, but out toward the creek, where the cottonwoods grew thick and the sound of water over stones provided a constant, gentle music. As they walked, Marian noticed that he'd done something to the path, cleared away rocks, smoothed out the roughest spots, making it easier for her to navigate in her condition. Elias, what is this? Patience, he said, taking her hand to help her over a fallen log. They reached a spot by the creek where the trees opened up to reveal a small clearing. And there, in the center of the clearing, Elias had built something, a simple bench made from smooth creek stones and a plank of wood, positioned perfectly to face the water and the mountains beyond. You made this? Marian's voice was full of wonder. Spent the last 3 evenings on it. Wanted to give you a place to sit and rest, to watch the water, to think. Figured once the baby comes, you might need a peaceful spot where you can just be. Marion ran her hand over the smooth wood of the seat, noting the care he'd taken to sand away any splinters, to position it just right. It's beautiful. Sit with me? Elias asked, and she did, settling carefully onto the bench beside him. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky and the first stars begin to appear. A cool breeze moved through the cottonwoods, rustling the leaves in their autumn colors. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called, and another answered. Marion, Elias said finally, turning to face her. 6 weeks ago, I walked into Fletcher's store planning to buy supplies and keep moving. I'd spent years telling myself that staying in one place was too dangerous, that caring about people only led to loss, that the only way to survive was to keep moving and never look back. He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. Then I saw you standing there trying to trade your wedding ring for food, and something in me just broke open. I couldn't walk away. And every day since then, you've given me reasons to stay. Not just the work that needed doing, but you. Your strength, your courage, your kindness, your stubborn refusal to give up even when everything seemed impossible. Marion's eyes were bright with tears in the dimming light. I'm not a rich man, Elias continued. I can't offer you a fancy house or an easy life. I don't have land or money or anything most folks would consider a proper foundation for marriage. All I have is myself, my hands, my heart, and a promise that I'll spend every day for the rest of my life trying to make you happy and keep you safe. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, Marion gasped. It was a ring, simple, made of braided copper wire that gleamed in the starlight. I made it from wire I found in Daniel's tool shed, Elias said quietly. I hope you don't mind. It seemed right somehow, building our future from pieces of the past. It's not much. It's perfect, Marion whispered. Marion Hale, will you marry me? Not because anyone else thinks we should, but because I love you, and I want to spend my life with you and the child you're carrying. Will you let me be a husband to you and a father to your baby? Will you help me learn how to stay in one place and build something lasting? Yes. The word came out choked with tears. Yes, Elias, of course, yes. He slipped the copper ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, because he'd spent days getting the size right, measuring against a ribbon when she wasn't looking. Then he pulled her close and kissed her properly. Not the brief kiss they'd shared at the dance, but something deeper, a promise, and a beginning all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying and laughing at the same time. Marion held up her hand, watching the copper ring catch the starlight. It's the most beautiful ring I've ever seen, she said. More beautiful than Daniel's? The question was gentle, not jealous. Different beautiful. She touched the gold wedding band that still rested on her other hand. Daniel gave me the ring that marked the beginning of my first life, the one we were supposed to have together. You're giving me the ring that marks the beginning of my second life, the one we'll build from here. Both are precious. Both are real. You'll keep wearing his ring? If that's all right with you. I thought maybe I could wear it on a chain around my neck, keep it close to my heart. He was the father of my child, Elias. I don't want to forget him or pretend he didn't matter. I would never ask you to do that. Elias touched her face gently. Love isn't a limited resource, Marion. You can love Daniel's memory and love me too. They're not in competition. How did I get so lucky, she whispered, to find love twice in one lifetime? I think we both got lucky. Against all odds, we found each other exactly when we needed to. They sat on the bench by the creek until the night grew cold and the stars blazed bright overhead. They talked about wedding plans, simple, at the church in town with whoever wanted to come. They talked about names for the baby, about how they'd manage the winter, about all the ordinary and extraordinary things that made up a life. When should we do it? Marion asked. The wedding, I mean. Soon, Elias said. Before the baby comes, before winter really sets in, maybe 2 weeks? That gives us time to prepare, but doesn't leave us waiting too long. 2 weeks, Marion repeated, testing the words. That's barely enough time to... To what? We don't need a fancy ceremony or a huge celebration. We just need a preacher, a witness or two, and each other. You're right. She leaned against his shoulder. I spent months planning my wedding to Daniel, worrying about every detail, making sure everything was perfect. And it was beautiful, But looking back, the only thing that really mattered was the vows we made to each other. Everything else was just decoration. So we keep it simple. Focus on what matters. Simple sounds perfect. They walked back to the cabin slowly, Marion's hand in Elias's, the copper ring catching moonlight with every step. When they reached the cabin, Elias walked her to the door, and she turned to him with sudden mischief in her eyes. "So, now that we're engaged, does that mean you'll be moving out of the barn?" "Not until we're married proper. Gossip is one thing, but I won't give folks actual ammunition." Ever the gentleman. But she was smiling. "Your reputation matters, Marion. I won't do anything to damage it further. My reputation is already damaged just by virtue of being a pregnant widow with a cowboy on my property. But I appreciate the sentiment." She kissed him softly. "Good night, Elias. Thank you for the most perfect proposal I could have imagined." "Good night, Marion. Sleep well." He watched until she was safely inside, then walked back to the barn with a lightness in his step that had nothing to do with the ground beneath his feet. He was engaged. He was going to be married. He, Elias Boone, professional drifter and man without roots, was going to have a wife and a family and a home. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a peace he hadn't felt since before the war, since before loss had taught him that caring about people meant risking everything. But maybe risk was worth it. Maybe the possibility of love was worth the certainty of pain. Maybe Bridger had been right when he said that avoiding happiness to avoid hurt was just another form of dying. Elias lay down in the barn, soon to be a proper barn with walls and a roof, thanks to Bridger's lumber, and looked up at the stars through the gaps in the boards. Somewhere out there, beyond those stars, maybe Daniel Hale was looking down and seeing what was happening to his widow and his unborn child. "I'll take care of them," Elias said quietly to the darkness, to the stars, to whatever ghosts might be listening. "I swear it. I'll be the father your child needs and the husband your wife deserves. And I'll make sure they know about you, about how much you love them, about the life you wanted to build. Your legacy doesn't end just because mine is beginning." The wind whispered through the barn, gentle and approving, and Elias chose to take it as a sign. The next morning, word of their engagement spread through Tucson faster than wildfire through dry grass. Mrs. Patterson arrived before noon, breathless with excitement and carrying a basket of food. "I knew it," she crowed, hugging Marion despite her protestations. "I told my husband at that dance, I said, those two are falling in love whether they know it or not, and I was right." "Yes, you were very perceptive," Marion said dryly, but she was smiling. "Now, we have 2 weeks to plan a wedding, which is barely any time at all, but we'll manage. You'll need a dress. The blue calico is lovely, but not quite right for a wedding. And we'll need to arrange for food and flowers if we can find any this late in the season. And Mrs. Patterson," Elias interrupted gently, "we're planning to keep it simple, just a brief ceremony at the church, maybe a small gathering afterward." "Nonsense. This is a wedding, Mr. Boone, not a business transaction. Marion deserves a proper celebration." "What Marion deserves is what Marion wants," he said firmly. "And if she wants simple, then simple it is." Mrs. Patterson looked between them, then sighed. "You're right, of course. I just get excited about weddings. Haven't had a good one in Tucson for over a year." She patted Marion's hand. "But truly, dear, is there anything you need? Anything I can help with?" "Actually," Marion said slowly, "there is one thing. My wedding dress from when I married Daniel. I sold it months ago in Tucson, but I kept a piece of the lace from the collar, just a small piece. Do you think it would be possible to incorporate it into a new dress? Something borrowed from my past to carry into my future?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes grew misty. "Oh, honey, that's beautiful. Of course we can do that. In fact, I have fabric at home that would be perfect, cream-colored cotton with a bit of embroidery at the hem. It's not fancy, but it's lovely and appropriate. We could make you a simple dress with long sleeves and a high collar, incorporate Daniel's lace right at the throat. What do you think?" "I think that sounds perfect." The two women immediately began planning, their voices overlapping with talk of patterns and measurements and alterations. Elias excused himself to continue work on the barn, leaving them to it. As he worked, he found his mind wandering to the future. In 2 weeks, He'd be a married man. Shortly after that, he'd be a father. The baby was due in December, which gave them perhaps 6 weeks to prepare. 6 weeks to finish the barn, stock up on supplies for winter, make sure everything was secure and safe. 6 weeks to transform from two individuals into a family. It seemed like both too much time and not nearly enough. Tom Bridger showed up that afternoon, ostensibly to help with the barn, but really to offer gruff congratulations. "About time," was all he said, but his handshake was warm and his smile genuine. "Thank you for everything. The lumber, the advice, the help. That's what neighbors do." Bridger picked up a hammer. "Now, let's get this barn finished so you have one less thing to worry about when winter comes." They worked side by side in comfortable silence, the rhythm of hammers and saws providing a steady soundtrack. As the afternoon wore on, other people began to arrive. Neighbors Elias hadn't even met, offering congratulations and assistance. The Jensens came with more lumber. A young couple named Martinez brought nails and hinges. Even the local preacher stopped by to confirm the wedding date and offer his services free of charge. "Daniel Hale was a good man," Reverend Walsh said, his weathered face kind. "I'm glad to see his widow finding happiness again. And Mr. Boone, I'm glad to see you're willing to step up and take on the responsibilities that come with marriage and fatherhood." "Thank you, Reverend. That means a lot." By the time the sun set, the barn was nearly complete. Walls up, roof on, door hung. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid and weather-tight, exactly what they needed. Marion made supper for everyone who'd helped, stretching their supplies to feed a dozen people. They ate outside as the stars came out, and someone produced a fiddle, and before long there was music and laughter filling the desert night. Elias sat with Marion on the porch steps, watching their neighbors celebrate. She leaned against his shoulder, tired but happy. "I can't believe how much has changed," she said quietly. 2 months ago, I was alone and starving and convinced I was going to lose everything. Now look at this, a completed cabin, a finished barn, friends and neighbors, and a wedding in 2 weeks. It's like a dream." "It's real," Elias assured her. "We built this, Marion. You and me and everyone who helped. It's real, and it's ours." "Ours," she repeated softly, savoring the word. "I like the sound of that." The music continued late into the night, and when everyone finally went home, Elias and Marion stood together in their yard, looking at everything they'd accomplished. "2 more weeks," Marion said. "2 more weeks," Elias agreed. "Are you scared?" "Terrified," he admitted, but in a good way. In a "this matters so much I can barely breathe" kind of way. "Me too." She took his hand. "But Elias, I'm also more certain about this than I've been about anything in my life. We're going to be all right, better than all right. We're going to build something beautiful here." He pulled her close, careful of her belly, and held her under the stars. "Yes," he said, "we are." And standing there in the darkness, surrounded by everything they'd built, and everything they still had to build, Elias Boone finally understood what home meant. It wasn't a place or a piece of land. It was this, a woman's hand in his, a future stretching out before them, and the courage to believe that love was worth the risk of loss. 2 weeks until the wedding, 2 weeks until everything changed. He couldn't wait. The 2 weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Marion spent her days with Mrs. Patterson and several other women from town who'd softened their attitudes now that a wedding was imminent, stitching together the cream-colored dress that would mark her second chance at happiness. The piece of lace from her first wedding dress was carefully incorporated at the collar, a delicate bridge between past and present. Elias threw himself into final preparations for winter, working from dawn until dark to ensure everything was ready. The barn was complete now, solid and weather-tight. He'd purchased 3 chickens and a milk cow from the Jensens, bought on credit that he'd pay back with labor come spring, so they'd have eggs and milk through the winter months. The cistern was full of clean water, and the cabin was stocked with enough supplies to weather even the worst storms. But as the wedding day approached, Elias found himself plagued by doubts that crept in during the quiet hours. He'd wake in the darkness of the barn, his heart racing with questions he couldn't answer. What if he failed Marion? What if he couldn't provide for her and the baby? What if his years of drifting had broken something in him that made him incapable of staying, of being the husband and father they needed? Tom Bridger found him one afternoon 5 days before the wedding, sitting on the creek bank staring at the water with an expression that suggested he was wrestling with demons. "You're thinking too much," Bridger said without preamble, settling down beside him. "How do you know?" "Because I've seen that look before. Wore it myself years ago, back when I still had the chance to do something about it." Bridger picked up a smooth stone and turned it over in his weathered hands. "What's eating at you? What if I can't do this? Stay in one place, be a husband, raise a child that isn't mine?" The words came out in a rush, as if Elias had been holding them back for days. "I've spent 15 years running, Tom. What if I don't know how to stop?" "You already stopped. The day you gave that woman your purse in Fletcher's store, you stopped running." Bridger threw the stone into the water, watching ripples spread across the surface. "Everything since then has just been you figuring out what stopping looks like." "But what if—" "No." Bridger's voice was firm. "No more what-ifs. You love her?" "Yes." "You want to be with her, raise that baby, build a life here?" "More than anything." "Then that's all you need to know. The rest, the doubts, the fears, the worry, that's just noise. Every man gets cold feet before his wedding. Difference is whether he lets those cold feet freeze him in place or whether he walks forward anyway." Elias was quiet for a long moment. "How do you live with the fear of losing someone again?" "You don't live with it. You live despite it." Bridger's voice softened. "I lost my wife 30 years ago, and it nearly destroyed me. I spent years alone telling myself it was safer that way, that I couldn't survive losing someone else. But you know what I figured out eventually? I was already destroyed. Loneliness was killing me just as surely as grief would have, only slower and quieter. At least grief means you had something worth losing." "That's a hell of a philosophy." "It's the only one that makes sense." Bridger stood, brushing dirt from his pants. "Now stop sitting here feeling sorry for yourself and go help your bride-to-be. I saw Mrs. Patterson heading up to the cabin with about 6 other women, and Marion's going to need rescuing from all that helpful advice." Elias smiled despite himself. "You're right. Thank you, Tom. That's what friends are for. Now get moving." When Elias reached the cabin, he found it full of women, fabric, and animated conversation. Marion stood in the center of it all, wearing the partially finished wedding dress, while Mrs. Patterson pinned the hem and 3 other women offered conflicting advice about the sleeves. "Ladies," Elias said from the doorway, and all conversation stopped. "I hate to interrupt, but I need to borrow my fiancée for a few minutes." "The dress isn't finished," Mrs. Patterson protested. "Then it'll wait a few more minutes." He held out his hand to Marion. "Please?" She took it gratefully, and he led her outside, away from the well-meaning chaos. They walked to their bench by the creek, the one he'd built for his proposal, and sat down in the cooling afternoon air. "Thank you," Marion said, leaning against him. "I love those women dearly, but if I heard one more opinion about whether the sleeves should be gathered or pleated, I was going to scream. They mean well." "I know, and I'm grateful for their help. It's just overwhelming sometimes." She placed both hands on her belly, where the baby was making its presence known with increasingly vigorous movements. 5 days until we're married, 4 more weeks, maybe 5, until this little one arrives. Everything is happening so fast." "Too fast?" "No." She said it firmly. "Not too fast, just a lot. Good things, but a lot of them all at once." She turned to look at him. "Are you having second thoughts?" "More like 50th thoughts, but they all come back to the same place. I want this. I want you. I want us." "Even with all the complications? The gossip? The baby? The struggle to make this land work?" "Especially with all the complications." He took her hand, the one with his copper ring glinting in the sunlight. "Marion, I've lived an uncomplicated life for 15 years. No ties, no obligations, no one depending on me. You know what I learned? Uncomplicated is just another word for empty. I'll take complicated if it means I get to be with you." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, and when they pulled apart, her eyes were bright with tears. "I love you, Elias Boone." "I love you too, Marion Hale, soon to be Marion Boone." "Actually," she said carefully, "I've been thinking about that. Would you mind if I kept Hale as part of my name? Marion Hale Boone? I want to honor Daniel's memory, and I want the baby to share part of their father's name. I think that's perfect, Elias said without hesitation. Daniel was part of making you who you are. I'm not trying to erase that. Have I mentioned that you're a remarkable man? Once or twice, but I don't mind hearing it again. They sat together until the sun began to set, talking about everything and nothing, until Mrs. Patterson appeared on the cabin porch, calling for Marion to come finish the final fitting before the light failed completely. The day before the wedding, unexpected guests arrived. Elias was checking the animals when he heard a wagon approaching and looked up to see an older couple climbing down, their faces weathered but kind. The woman was plump and gray-haired, wearing a serviceable brown dress and a warm smile. The man was tall and spare, with keen blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Can I help you?" Elias called out, walking toward them. "We're looking for Marion Hale," the woman said. "I'm Margaret Carson, and this is my husband Henry. We're Daniel's parents." Elias felt his stomach drop. Daniel's parents. He'd known they existed. Marion had mentioned them once or twice, but she'd said they lived in California and hadn't approved of the marriage. What were they doing here now? "I'll get her," he managed. "Please, make yourselves comfortable." He found Marion in the cabin, putting the finishing touches on a pie for tomorrow's celebration. When he told her who was outside, all color drained from her face. His parents, here. Her hand flew to her throat. "But they haven't written since Daniel died. They blamed me for his coming west, for his death." "Why would they come now?" "Only one way to find out." Elias took her hand. "I'll be right beside you." They walked out together, and Elias felt Marion's hand tighten on his as they approached the Carsons. Margaret's eyes went immediately to Marion's pregnant belly, and something in her expression crumbled. "Oh, my dear girl," she said, her voice breaking. "Look at you, carrying our grandchild and all alone out here in this wilderness." "I'm not alone," Marion said quietly, and Elias felt a surge of gratitude at her words. "This is Elias Boone. We're getting married tomorrow." Henry Carson's eyes narrowed slightly, assessing Elias with the critical gaze of a father, or in this case, a father-in-law, evaluating the man who would step into his son's place. "Kinda quick, isn't it? Daniel's only been gone a few months." "6 months, sir," Marion said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And I'm not trying to replace your son. No one could do that. But I have to survive, and so does the baby. Elias has been helping me do that." "We heard rumors," Margaret said softly. "Back in California. Someone who'd passed through Tucson said Daniel Hale's widow had taken up with a cowboy, that she was disgracing his memory. We came to see if it was true, to take you back with us if necessary, to save you from," she gestured helplessly, "from whatever situation you'd gotten yourself into." "I'm not disgracing Daniel's memory," Marion said, and now there was steel in her voice. "I'm honoring it by surviving, by fighting to keep the home he started to build, by making sure his child is born into a stable, loving family. If you think that's a disgrace, then you don't know your son as well as you think you did." "Marion," Henry started, but his wife held up a hand. "No, she's right." Margaret's eyes were streaming with tears now. "We've been terrible to you, haven't we? We blamed you for Daniel's choices, for his death, when the truth is we were just angry at God for taking our son. And instead of helping you, supporting you, being there for our grandchild, we abandoned you. Can you forgive us?" The question hung in the air like a held breath. Elias felt Marion trembling beside him, caught between hurt and hope, between the pain they'd caused and the reconciliation they were offering. "Come inside," Marion finally said. "Let me make coffee, and we can talk properly." They spent the next 2 hours around the small table in the cabin, talking through grief and misunderstanding, blame and forgiveness. The Carsons explained that they'd been devastated by Daniel's death, that in their pain they'd lashed out at Marion because it was easier than accepting that sometimes terrible things just happened. They'd received her letters about the baby, about her struggles, but pride and hurt had kept them from responding. "Then we heard about you getting remarried," Henry said, looking at Elias. "And Margaret said we had to come, had to see if you were all right, if this man was treating you right, or if you were just desperate and making a mistake." "And what do you think now?" Marion asked quietly. Margaret reached across the table and took Marion's hand. I think you found someone who loves you and wants to protect you. I think my son would approve, if he were here to say so. And I think we've been fools to waste so much time on pride and anger when we should have been helping you. We'd like to stay for the wedding, Henry added, if you'll have us. And we'd like to be part of the baby's life, if you'll allow it. Not to replace you or to interfere, but just to be grandparents, to know our son's child. Marion was crying now, and Elias put his arm around her shoulders, offering silent support. Yes, she managed. Yes, please stay. Please be part of this. The baby should know their grandparents, should know about Daniel, should have family. Thank you, Margaret whispered. Thank you for being more gracious than we deserve. That evening, after the Carsons had been set up in the barn, at their insistence, despite offers to take the cabin, Elias and Marion stood together watching the stars appear. That was unexpected, Elias said. Completely. Marion leaned into him. But good, I think. The baby should have grandparents, and I think Daniel would be happy about this. About all of it. You think he'd approve of me? I think he'd be grateful to you, for saving us, for loving us, for being willing to raise his child as your own. She touched his face gently. Tomorrow, we get married. Are you ready? I've been ready since the day I met you. Just took me a while to realize it. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the windows in delicate patterns that caught the morning light. Marion woke early, her stomach fluttering with nerves and excitement. Mrs. Patterson arrived at dawn with 3 other women, and they swept Marion up in a flurry of preparations. Bathing, dressing, arranging her hair with small wildflowers that somehow Mrs. Patterson had found despite the season. When Marion finally looked at herself in the small mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The cream-colored dress fit perfectly, the high collar with Daniel's lace at her throat, the long sleeves gathered at the wrists, the fabric flowing over her pregnant belly in a way that was modest but beautiful. Her hair was pinned up with the wildflowers woven through it, and her face glowed with happiness despite the shadows under her eyes from a restless night. You look beautiful, dear, Margaret Carson said from the doorway, her voice thick with emotion. Just beautiful. Daniel would be so proud. Thank you, Marion whispered, for being here, for accepting this. Thank you for letting us be part of it. The church in Tucson was small but packed when they arrived. It seemed like half the town had turned out, people who'd once whispered about the pregnant widow and her cowboy now smiling and offering congratulations. The Jensens were there with their children. Tom Bridger sat in the back, his weathered face softened with uncharacteristic emotion. Even Cyrus Fletcher had shown up, though he had the grace to look ashamed when Marion's eyes found his. And at the front of the church, standing beside Reverend Walsh, was Elias. He wore his best clothes, still trail-worn but clean and pressed, and his hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. But it was his eyes that caught Marion's attention as she walked down the aisle on Henry Carson's arm. They were full of love and wonder and a vulnerability that made her heart ache with tenderness. When Henry placed her hand in Elias's, the older man leaned close and whispered, "Take care of her. Take care of them both." "With my life," Elias promised, and Henry nodded, satisfied. Reverend Walsh began the ceremony with words about love and commitment, about the sacred bond of marriage and the responsibilities it carried. But Marion barely heard him, too focused on Elias's face, on the way his hand trembled slightly as it held hers, on the absolute certainty in his eyes. When it came time for vows, Reverend Walsh offered them the traditional words, but Elias shook his head slightly. "I'd like to say my own, if that's all right." "Of course, my son." Elias turned to face Marion fully, his voice steady despite the emotion in it. "Marion, I came to this territory with nothing but a horse and a destination. I thought I knew where I was going, thought I had my life figured out. Then I met you, and everything changed. You showed me that home isn't a place, it's a person. You showed me that love doesn't have to end in loss, that caring about someone isn't weakness, but strength. You showed me what it means to be brave, to keep fighting even when everything seems hopeless." He paused, swallowing hard. "I promise to spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of the trust you're placing in me. I promise to be a husband to you and a father to your child. I promise to remember Daniel and honor his memory, to make sure his legacy lives on through the family we're building. I promise to stay, even when staying is hard, because you're worth staying for. I promise to love you with everything I have for as long as I live." There wasn't a dry eye in the church by the time he finished. Marian took a shaky breath, then spoke her own vows. "Elias, you came into my life when I'd given up hope. You saw me at my lowest, when I was starving and desperate and ready to give up, and you chose to help. Not for what you could get from it, but because it was the right thing to do. You've given me everything: food, shelter, security, but more than that, you've given me hope. Hope for a future. Hope for happiness. Hope that maybe life has more chapters than I thought." Her voice wavered but held steady. "I promise to be a wife to you, a partner in building the life we've dreamed of. I promise to love you not as a replacement for what I lost, but as the beginning of something new. I promise to trust you with my heart and my child. I promise to stay by your side through whatever comes, hard winters, difficult seasons, moments of doubt. I promise to love you with everything I am for all the days of my life." "Then by the power vested in me," Reverend Walsh said, his voice gentle, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Elias, you may kiss your bride." Elias cupped Marian's face in his calloused hands and kissed her tenderly, and the church erupted in applause and cheers. When they pulled apart, both were crying and laughing at once, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd just done. They'd gotten married. They were a family now. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. Tables had been set up outside the church with food that neighbors had contributed: roasted chickens, fresh bread, pies made from preserved fruit, and even a small cake that Mrs. Patterson had somehow managed to create. There was music from fiddles and guitars, dancing on the packed earth, children running and playing while their parents ate and talked and celebrated. Marian and Elias moved through it all in a happy daze, accepting congratulations, sharing food, dancing carefully to avoid jostling the baby. At one point, Marian found herself standing with Margaret Carson, watching Elias talk with Henry and Tom Bridger. "He's a good man," Margaret said quietly. "I can see why you chose him." "I didn't choose him so much as we found each other," Marian replied. "But yes, he's very good, better than I deserve." "Don't say that. You deserve every happiness." Margaret touched Marian's arm. "I know we haven't earned the right to ask anything of you, but Henry and I were wondering, when the baby comes, might we be allowed to help? Not to take over or interfere, but just to be there if you need us?" "I'd like that," Marian said, and meant it. "The baby should know their grandparents." "And the father?" Margaret's voice was careful. "Will you tell them about Daniel?" "Of course. Every day if necessary. They'll know that Daniel loved them before they were born, that he was building a home for them, that he would have been a wonderful father. And they'll know that Elias chose to love them too, to step into that role not from obligation, but from love. They're lucky to have both fathers in their way." Margaret smiled sadly. "And I'm grateful that my son's legacy will live on through the family you're building." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the celebration, Elias found Marian sitting on the church steps, watching the festivities with a hand on her belly. "Tired?" he asked, settling beside her. "Exhausted. Happy, but exhausted." She leaned against him. "Can you believe this is real? That we're actually married?" "Not quite yet. Keep expecting to wake up in some dusty town, on my way to somewhere else, discovering this was all a dream." "If it's a dream, I don't want to wake up." They sat together as the celebration continued around them, watching their neighbors, their friends now, dance and laugh and celebrate. Watching Daniel's parents talk with Tom Bridger, seeing Mrs. Patterson organize the cleanup with military efficiency, noting how the setting sun painted everything in gold and amber. "We should head home soon," Elias said eventually. "You need rest, and we've got a long ride ahead." "Home," Marian repeated softly. "I love that word. I love that we have a home to go to." The ride back to the homestead took an hour, the wagon rumbling over familiar ruts as stars began to appear overhead. Marian dozed against Elias's shoulder, exhausted from the emotions and activity of the day. When they arrived, Elias helped her down carefully and they stood together in the yard, looking at the cabin with its finished roof and sturdy walls, the barn standing solid against the night sky. "Look at what we built," Marion said. "2 months ago, this place was falling apart. Now it's a home." "We're not done yet. Still got to get through winter, prepare for the baby." "I know, but Elias, look at it. Really look. We did this, together." He did look, seeing it through her eyes, not just the physical structures, but what they represented. Hope, survival, the stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up would have been easier. Two broken people building something whole from their shattered pieces. "Come on, Mrs. Boone," he said, savoring her new name. "Let's get you inside and off your feet." That night, for the first time, Elias slept in the cabin instead of the barn. They'd arranged the space to give them both privacy and togetherness. A curtain could be drawn across the room if needed, but for now it stayed open, letting them talk quietly in the darkness. "Are you happy?" Marion asked from the narrow bed. Elias had insisted on taking blankets on the floor despite her protests, saying they'd figure out better arrangements later, but for now she needed proper rest. "Happier than I've been in 15 years, maybe ever." "Me too." There was wonder in her voice. "I thought that part of my life was over, feeling happy, feeling hopeful. Daniel's death nearly destroyed me. But somehow, we found each other exactly when we both needed finding." "You think he had something to do with it? Daniel, I mean, sending me to that store at that exact moment?" "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe it was just good timing. Does it matter?" "No," Elias said after a moment. "I suppose it doesn't. We're here now, together. That's what matters." They fell silent, listening to the familiar sounds of the desert night, wind through the cottonwoods, the distant call of an owl, the settling of the cabin's timbers. Peaceful sounds. Home sounds. "Elias?" Marion's voice was sleepy now. "Thank you for everything. For saving my life, for staying, for marrying me. For giving me a future when I thought I didn't have one. Thank you for letting me stay. For seeing past the drifter to the man who wanted to be more. For giving me a reason to put down roots. We're going to be all right, aren't we? Better than all right. We're going to be happy." And with that promise hanging in the air between them, they both drifted off to sleep. The first night of their married life, the beginning of the family they were building together. Winter came early that year, bringing cold winds and occasional snow that painted the desert in white. But the cabin stayed warm, the animals stayed fed, and Marion grew larger as December approached. The Carsons had returned to California but wrote regularly now, sending money and supplies and promises to return when the baby was born. Tom Bridger stopped by weekly, ostensibly to check on their supplies, but really to make sure Elias wasn't going stir-crazy being cooped up through the worst weather. Mrs. Patterson and other women from town came when they could, bringing food and company and advice about the coming birth. 2 days before Christmas, on a night when snow fell soft and silent outside, Marion woke Elias with a hand on his shoulder. "It's time," she said quietly. "The baby's coming." Everything that followed was a blur of organized chaos. Elias rode through the snow to fetch Mrs. Henderson, the midwife, nearly killing his horse in his haste. Tom Bridger appeared as if summoned, helping to boil water and keep the fire going while Mrs. Henderson took charge of the bedroom with the calm authority of someone who'd delivered hundreds of babies. For Elias, waiting was torture. He paced the cabin, wearing a path in the floorboards, jumping at every sound from behind the curtain where Marion labored. He heard her cry out once, a sound of pain and effort that nearly broke him, and started toward the curtain before Bridger's hand on his arm stopped him. "Let the women work," Bridger said firmly. "Your job is to be here when it's done." It felt like forever, but was probably only a few hours. Then, just as the winter sun was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, Elias heard a sound that stopped his heart and started it again, the thin, wavering cry of a newborn baby. Mrs. Henderson emerged from behind the curtain, her sleeves rolled up and her face tired but smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Boone? A healthy, strong son. And Marion's doing fine, tired, but fine." Elias felt his knees go weak with relief. "Can I see them?" "Give us just a few more minutes to get them settled." Those minutes felt longer than all the hours before them. Finally, Mrs. Henderson beckoned him over, and Elias stepped behind the curtain to find Marian propped up against pillows, her face pale with exhaustion but glowing with joy. And in her arms, wrapped in a blanket Mrs. Patterson had made, was a tiny, red-faced baby boy. "Meet your son," Marian said softly, and Elias felt something in his chest crack open at those words. Your son. Not Daniel's son, not just her son, but his. He knelt beside the bed, reaching out with a trembling hand to touch the baby's incredibly soft cheek. The infant's eyes opened slightly, unfocused but searching, and one tiny hand wrapped around Elias's finger with surprising strength. "He's perfect," Elias whispered, his voice breaking. "Marian, he's absolutely perfect. We're naming him Daniel," she said. "Daniel Elias Hale Boone, after the man who gave him life and the man who chose to give him love." "Daniel Elias," Elias repeated, testing the name. "That's good. That's right." He stayed there on his knees beside the bed, watching mother and child, marveling at the tiny life they were now responsible for. This small person, barely an hour old, had no idea what he'd been born into: the love, the sacrifice, the complicated beauty of a family built from loss and hope. "Are you scared?" Marian asked quietly. "Terrified," Elias admitted. "I have no idea how to be a father. Neither did I know how to be a mother when I found out I was pregnant. But we'll figure it out together. That's what families do." Mrs. Henderson shooed everyone out eventually, insisting that Marian needed rest. Elias moved to the main room, sitting by the fire with Tom Bridger, both men staring into the flames without speaking. "You did good, son," Bridger finally said. "Real good. I didn't do anything except pace and worry. You stayed. You married her, built a home, made yourself available to be a father. That's doing plenty." Bridger stood, stretching. "I'll head out, let you have time with your family." "But Elias? That child in there is lucky. They'll grow up knowing they were wanted, that they matter, that they have people who will fight for them. Not every child gets that." After Bridger left, Elias sat alone in the quiet cabin, listening to the sounds of his wife and child sleeping. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the desert in white, making everything clean and new. He thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, rootless, alone, convinced that staying in one place would only lead to pain. He thought about walking into Fletcher's store, seeing Marian with that ring in her hand, making the split-second decision that had changed everything. If he'd walked past that store, if he'd minded his own business, if he'd stuck to his plan and headed to Mexico, where would he be now? Working with horses for the Mexican army, sleeping in a bunkhouse with other drifters, still running from the possibility of connection because connection meant vulnerability and vulnerability meant pain. Instead, he was here. In a cabin he'd helped repair with a wife he loved and a child he'd sworn to raise as his own. He had neighbors who'd become friends, a community that had grudgingly accepted him, a purpose that went beyond his next paycheck. He had a home. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. Elias woke to find Marian already awake, nursing the baby with a look of such tender concentration that it made his heart ache. "Merry Christmas," she said softly. "Merry Christmas." He came to sit beside them, putting his arm around Marian's shoulders. "How are you feeling?" "Sore. Exhausted. Happier than I ever thought possible." She looked up at him. "We did it, Elias. We made a family." "You did the hard part." "No, we both did hard parts, just different ones." Little Daniel finished nursing and fell asleep against Marian's chest, his tiny face relaxed and peaceful. Elias reached out and touched the baby's downy hair, marveling at how something so small could feel so monumentally important. "I was thinking," Marian said carefully, "about what we should tell him about his father, about Daniel. We tell him the truth, that his father was a good man who loved him before he was born, who died trying to build a better life for his family, that he was a skilled carpenter and a loving husband, that he deserves to be remembered and honored. And about you? That I'm the man who chose to love him, who chose to be his father not from obligation but from want, that families can be made in different ways and they're all real as long as the love is real. He's so lucky to have you as a father. I'm lucky to have him as a son. Elias bent down and kissed the baby's forehead gently. Both of you. I'm the lucky one here. They spent Christmas Day quietly, just the three of them in their warm cabin while snow fell outside. Mrs. Henderson came by to check on Marion and the baby, pronouncing both healthy and thriving. Mrs. Patterson stopped in with food and gifts, including a beautiful cradle that her husband had made. Even the Jensens rode over with presents for the baby, tiny clothes and blankets and a carved wooden rattle. As evening fell and they were alone again, Elias stood at the window watching snow cover the land in white. Behind him he could hear Marion humming softly to the baby, a lullaby her mother had sung to her. The fire crackled warmly, the cabin smelled of pine and wood smoke and the peculiar sweet scent of new baby. This, Elias thought, this was what he'd been searching for all those years of drifting. Not adventure or fortune or escape from pain. Just this, a warm cabin, a woman he loved, a child to raise, and the deep, bone-settling knowledge that he belonged somewhere, to someone, for something. Come sit with us, Marion called softly. You're part of this family too, not just an observer. He joined them on the bed, carefully arranging himself so Marion could lean against him while the baby dozed between them. They sat like that for a long time, watching their son sleep, listening to winter wind whisper around the cabin walls. Do you ever regret it? Marion asked eventually. Giving up Mexico? Giving up the drifting life? Not even for a second. Do you regret asking me to stay? Never. She took his hand, the one with calluses from weeks of building and repairing. You gave me everything, Elias. A roof over my head, food in my belly, security for my child. But more than that, you gave me hope. You showed me that life goes on, that happiness is possible even after devastating loss, that love can find you even when you think you're beyond finding. You gave me those same things. I just didn't realize I needed them until I found them. Little Daniel stirred between them, making the small snuffling sounds newborns make. His tiny hand emerged from the blanket, fingers curling and uncurling in sleep. Elias reached out and let the baby grab his finger again, feeling that remarkable grip that seemed to say, I'm here, I'm real, I'm yours. I wrote a letter to Daniel's parents, Marion said, telling them about the baby, about the birth, about how we named him. I told them they have a grandson who looks just like their son, who already has his father's strong hands. That's good. They should know. I also told them about you, about how you're going to raise their grandson with love and care, how you'll make sure Daniel's memory stays alive while also giving the baby a present and a future. I hope that was all right. More than all right. Elias kissed the top of her head. This baby's going to know he comes from love on all sides. Daniel's love, our love, his grandparents' love. He's going to grow up rich in ways that have nothing to do with money. They sat together until the fire burned low and the baby woke hungry again. Elias built up the fire while Marion nursed. Then they all three settled down for the night. Marion in the bed with baby Daniel in his new cradle beside her. Elias on a bedroll nearby, close enough to help if needed, but giving them space. As he drifted off to sleep, Elias heard Marion whisper something into the darkness. He almost didn't catch it, but the words lodged in his heart with perfect clarity. Thank you, Daniel, for sending him to us. Thank you for the life we had and the child we made. And thank you, Elias, for the life we're building and the love you've given us. I'm the luckiest woman in the world to have been loved by two such good men. Elias didn't respond, didn't let her know he'd heard. Some words were meant to float into the universe without acknowledgement. But he smiled in the darkness, grateful for the grace of a woman who could honor her past while embracing her future, who could make room in her heart for both grief and joy. The winter passed slowly, but not harshly. They had enough food, enough firewood, enough of everything they needed. The baby thrived, growing stronger each day, his tiny features slowly resolving into a face that was part Daniel, part Marion, part entirely his own. Elias learned fatherhood one sleepless night and one diaper change at a time, fumbling through it with Marion's patient guidance. When spring came, bringing green to the desert and warmth back to the days, they stood together in their yard watching the land wake up. Little Daniel, Danny as they'd taken to calling him, was nestled in a sling against Marion's chest, his eyes bright and curious as he looked at the world. "Another year of planting ahead," Elias said, surveying the garden plot. "Think we can do better this year?" "We'll do fine. We know what we're doing now." Marion adjusted Danny's blanket. "And we're not doing it alone anymore. We have help, friends, family. That makes all the difference." Tom Bridger rode up then, his timing impeccable as always. He dismounted and came to look at Danny, his weathered face softening. "He's gotten big," Bridger observed. "Strong-looking, healthy." "Takes after his mother," Elias said. "Takes after all three of his parents," Bridger corrected. "The man who gave him life, the woman who brought him into the world, and the man who chose to raise him. That's a lucky child." "We're the lucky ones," Marion said firmly. "All of us." They stood together in the spring sunshine, 3 adults and 1 baby, looking at the land they'd fought so hard to keep. The cabin stood solid with its new roof gleaming in the light. The barn was finished and full of animals. The garden plot was ready for planting. The cistern was full of clean water. Everything they'd worked for, everything they'd built was ready for another year, another season, another chapter. "You know," Bridger said thoughtfully, "when I first saw you two, I thought you were both so broken that maybe you'd just break each other worse. Glad to see I was wrong." "We weren't broken," Marion said. "We were just unfinished. There's a difference." That's profound wisdom from someone so young. I learned it from a cowboy who stopped running long enough to build something real. Elias pulled her close, careful of the baby between them. "And I learned it from a widow who refused to give up even when giving up would have been easier. We taught each other." Danny made a small sound, not quite a cry, but definitely a complaint, and Marion laughed. "Someone's hungry again. This child eats like he's afraid the food will run out." "Smart child," Bridger said, always planning ahead. As Marion headed back to the cabin to feed Danny, Elias and Bridger stood together watching her go. The older man clapped him on the shoulder. "You did good, son. Real good. You took a bad situation and made something beautiful from it. Not many men could have done what you did." "I just did what needed doing." "No, you did what few men have the courage to do. You stopped running. You put down roots. You let yourself care, even though caring means risking loss. That takes real courage." "I had a good teacher." "Yeah, you did, but you were a good student." Bridger swung back up onto his mule. "I'll come by in a few days, help you with the planting. No arguments. That's what neighbors do." After he left, Elias stood alone in the yard for a few minutes more, taking in everything around him. The land was harsh, the work was hard, and there would be difficult days ahead. But they'd face those days together, as a family, with love and determination and the stubborn refusal to give up that had carried them this far. He thought about the man he'd been, the drifter with no home and no hope. He thought about the choice he'd made in Fletcher's store, the choice that had seemed so simple at the time but had actually been the most important decision of his life. He thought about how close he'd come to riding past, to missing all of this, to spending the rest of his life wondering what if. But he hadn't ridden past. He'd stopped. He'd helped. He'd stayed. And in staying, he'd found everything he'd been looking for without knowing he was looking for it. Elias Boone walked back to his cabin, to his wife and his son, to the home they'd built together from hope and hard work and love. The door closed behind him with a solid final sound, not the sound of a door shutting on possibility, but of a door opening on a future full of promise. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the mesquite and cottonwoods, carrying stories of second chances and new beginnings. The sun climbed higher in the spring sky, warming the earth and promising growth. And in a small cabin on the edge of the Arizona Territory, a family built from broken pieces began another day of their improbable, impossible, absolutely perfect life together. The cowboy had found his home. The widow had found her hope. The baby had found his father. And together they'd found that sometimes the best things in life come not from careful planning, but from the courage to help a stranger, to accept help when it's offered, and to believe that love, in all its complicated, messy, beautiful forms, is always worth the risk. Their story didn't end there, of course. There would be more challenges, more seasons, more years of building and growing and loving. But that's the thing about real stories, about real lives. They don't end neatly with a wedding or a birth. They continue, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. And this family, built from unlikely circumstances and impossible odds, would continue too, growing, changing, facing whatever came next with the same courage and determination that had brought them together in the first place. Because that's what love does. It gives you reasons to stay when leaving would be easier. It gives you strength when you think you have none left. It gives you hope when hope seems foolish. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it gives you a second chance at happiness when you thought all chances were gone. Elias, Marion, and little Danny had been given that chance, and they were going to make the most of every single day of it. The end of this chapter. The beginning of everything else.